Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 11th and final webinar of the T20 Summit season. This webinar is co-hosted by the T20 Saudi Arabia and the Observer Research Foundation, India. My name is Al-Jawhar Al-Gaid. I'm the coordinator for Task Force 11 on COVID-19, Multidisciplinary Approaches to Complex Problems. I'm also a researcher at CAPSAC, and today I will be the facilitator for the webinar. I would like to invite Dr. Yasin Arabi, Task Force 11 lead co-chair. Dr. Yasin is the chairman of the Intensive Care Department and medical director of respiratory services at King Abdulaziz Medical City. Dr. Yasin, I pass on the mic to you for opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Johar. Dear colleagues, it's my great pleasure to be with you today. In April 2020, T20 Saudi Arabia established a new task force that aims at looking at framing study issues related to COVID-19 pandemic. It has been my great pleasure to work with a wonderful team who worked on 6 different lines of effort with the goal or the theme of thinking outside the box. First, in our health cluster, our contributors highlighted a few themes: how we reinforce the role of research to learn from the pandemic, how we create global solutions to create greater capacity, how we focus on strengthening our healthcare systems as we are as strong as our weakest link, how we are viewing our health budgets as investment rather than a cost, how we address mental health component of the crisis, how we can support healthcare professionals who are on the front line around the world, who have shown courage and dedication during this health crisis. COVID-19 did not affect the health only, but affected many aspects of our life. It affected education, and in the education cluster, contributors characterized the pandemic as the most significant education shutdown known in history. We discussed in the theme, how to build back better our education to help education systems and students recover from this crisis. In the third cluster, climate and transport, the overarching question that we discussed, as we recover from the crisis, what kind of recovery we will get. In the fourth cluster, we looked at economic issues to include the importance of global value chains in times of crisis and international monetary policy. In the fifth cluster, our contributors focused on the topic of multilateralism. In the sixth and final cluster, we looked at the topic of social and technological issues. The journey of our task force, Task Force 11, has started in April. And in this relatively short timeline, we had several major milestones. In May 2020, we had the COVID-19 webinar. And in June, we had the first submission of policy draft, followed by a conference also in June. And then in July, we had a second policy draft, and then the communique was finalized in September. It has been an amazing journey with more than 100 abstracts received, 43 accepted, leading to 18 policy briefs. We are looking forward to the discussion today, and we welcome the collaboration with the Observer Research Foundation. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Saudi T20 Secretariat and Dr. Fahd Turki for his leadership, and Ms. Jawhar Gaid and the whole team from CAPSAC for doing such a great job. It has been a great pleasure working with all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Yasin, for introducing the Task Force webinar and setting the stage by summarizing our journey over the past year. And now we are delighted to welcome Dr. Samir Saran, President of Observer Research Foundation, who will be joined in conversation with His Excellency, Mr. Suresh Prabhu, India's G20 Sherpa, who will be joining through a video recording.
So welcome to this very special segment at this very important meeting organized by our partners in Saudi Arabia under the presidency of the kingdom. We are at a very important period as far as the global community is concerned, and we need some key institutions and organizations to respond to the immediate crisis of the pandemic, but the longer tail of responding to the economic slowdown, of building lives and livelihoods in the years ahead. We are joined today by one of India's most remarkable thinkers and political leaders, Shri Suresh Prabhu, who is India's G20 Sherpa, and much more. He is someone who has transformed Indian electricity sector. He has worked closely in India's rural transformations. He has led India's commerce and trade initiatives. He has re-energized the railways and the aviation sector. And today he will be architecting the Indian approach as it moves towards its own presidency in the year 2022, which also happens to be India's 75th year celebration since independence. Mr. Prabhu, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to this conversation.
Thank you.
Mr. Prabhu, you are very familiar with the process. You are very familiar with Saudi Arabia. You have made multiple visits there, even during the pandemic. Let me ask you a very simple, direct question. Is G20 a body competent to respond to the crisis today? And are we doing enough at the G20 to respond to both the immediate challenge and the longer term impact on our economies and our lives and livelihoods?
If you really look at it, the very fact that pandemic has affected more than 200 countries or territories, because some may not be sovereign countries, but still territories, but they affected more than 200 of those. And that shows that this is not just a simple local problem. It has a huge reach, and therefore it needs, if it is started from a local area, but has now reached global proportion, so obviously needs global response. The problem is global, the response has to be global. So which is that institution which can actually offer that response? Now it's not just a mere healthcare crisis, though it started like that. But now it has become economic crisis, it has become a social problem, it has become a challenge for science, it has become a problem for policymakers. So it has become a very multi-dimensional problem. Now, which is that institution in the world, which has the ability, which is that platform in the world, which can deal with such complex issues? And therefore, there is no other institution, even not in G20 is not an institution, but there is no other platform of the kind that G20 is to deal with such multi-dimensional, multifaceted problem that we are facing today. And therefore, G20 is far more relevant today than any other time in the past. We realized it way back when we had a financial crisis, that G20 must respond to it. And therefore, 2008 was a very remarkable year in which G20 addressed it in a very significant way. And some of the institutional steps that were taken have resulted in creating some response mechanism as well to deal with a contingency when it arises of that kind. But today, it is absolutely unprecedented, unparalleled, and I hope will not repeat again. But a kind of crisis that we are facing today has to be dealt with by first influential players in the world. And G20 has got 20 countries, but of course the countries who actually the platform provides also visibility to not just 20, but far more. So the head of many multilateral agencies participate, the heads of some of the regional groupings to participate. The African Union president comes in. So many players who participate in it besides the G20 countries, which are G20 economies, top 20 economies, which together constitute 86% of the global GDP. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine that if we want to deal with a massive problem of this scale, you also need people who have the ability to deal with it. They will have the convening power, the influence on global affairs. And I don't think there is anybody else, any other institution, another platform than G20 currently can deal with it. At the same time, there is also another dimension, which you really look at it, unfortunately, I repeat, unfortunately, because all the so-called multilateral institutions, which were created to deal with a specific problem, whether related to security, related to health, related to social issues, related to culture, related to economy, they are all becoming ineffective. They are all becoming non-participatory in some way. And therefore, there is a need for a stronger body like this at a time, again, I repeat, that this is absolutely, no one could imagine something like this could ever happen, and I hope not again. So therefore, I think G20 is a very important thing, and Saudi Arabia, to put on record, has played a very key role, because this is the first G20 year, presidency year, in which there is such a pandemic. So they are facing something, world is facing, but they are also facing it. But they handle it extremely well. Even today, I have a meeting with the G20 Sherpa, which is we are going on for 3 days. Next 3 days, we'll have meetings, 3-day long meetings, and which will again have another 3-day long meetings just before the Leaders Summit on the little later in the month. So I think we really are looking forward to G20 playing a more effective role.
Sir, you mentioned a very important point, the ineffectiveness of traditional multilateral institutions and approaches. Let me add one more complication. We are also seeing an increase in political conflicts and contests. We are also seeing a degree of economic nationalism, a retreat from globalization in many parts of the world. In this political climate, can the G20 deliver, and how can we overcome it as a grouping so that we can focus on economics even as we continue to have differences in the political domain?
You're absolutely right. There is a real emergence of new spirit in the world, which does not necessarily capture the essence of the solution that we really need to seek together. And therefore, people are turning inwards. People are trying to think that they can solve, they forget solving, but they don't want to deal with global problems, so they would like to be confined to their own borders, forgetting the fact that whether we like it or not, we have come a long way. And therefore, we have to deal with some of the complex problems together. Let us look at vaccine. Everybody says that vaccine is a problem to corona. Well, absolutely true. May not be the 100% solution, but still a problem. It's still a solution. But if it is a solution, then vaccine development must happen collaboratively.
Mm-hmm.
It must happen not just in the laboratories collaboratively, but even delivery of it, even the testing of it, even the kind of volunteers who are coming forward to offer themselves as like a live laboratories to test whether this is going to work on the human bodies or not. All of this needs global effort. And therefore, in situation like this, you cannot address a problem of this kind. Let us take another example of another problem, climate change. You think, can you deal climate change on your own?
Mm-hmm.
Like healthcare, you cannot deal on your own. Climate change also cannot be dealt on their own. And the problem cannot be dealt on their own, but also solutions cannot be found unless we work together. And we realized, and we are a beneficiary, the world is a beneficiary of it. We have the solution of it, so we don't act on it is a different thing. United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change created a body for the scientists. And that body has really come out with solutions to the problem. They know exactly, the science has proved what a climate change is. So why did it happen? The scientists of all the world came together. If there was no scientific community coming together like this, at least firstly, the acceptability of that science would not have been as good as it is today. And moreover, that particular science would not have been able to come out with such ideas unless they had come together. So coming together is the most important aspect of solving today's global problem. And no problem is local anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you look at this, but take example of this. It started in China and it has now engulfed the whole world. Now the second wave which is coming is affecting Europe so badly. So can any continent, any country, any geography can say we are immune to this? It's no longer true. And same thing with climate change. Like for example, US is suffering one of the worst forest fires this year.
Correct.
On the west coast. Also facing at the same time some of the worst typhoons. They always this is a season for those, but this season, this particular year was the worst year in terms of receiving so many of these natural calamities in one single year. They don't start in US. They start somewhere maybe in Africa, in the oceans of Africa. But they travel long distance to hit the US coast. So ultimately, the problems are really speaking, you cannot stop the problem. When the tsunami hit the India and so many Asian countries, where did tsunami start? It didn't start in India. It didn't start in Sri Lanka. It didn't start in Indonesia. It started somewhere else. So it starts somewhere else, but hits the other countries. So obviously, you cannot now come and say that I have nothing to do with this. I will solve my own problem. It is not possible anymore for any country to think like this. At least on some issues, global action, global cooperation, global collaboration is absolutely essential.
And are you sensing that in your G20 interactions that your group is actually working beyond politics and trying to find a common framework approach for some of these global issues that you listed, which I will come back to a little later? But are you sensing the mood in your own community who's tirelessly working through the pandemic to find these collective action frameworks?
See, let us accept the reality that 20 countries come from 20 different backgrounds. The different nationalities, obviously, they will try to bring that baggage of their own priorities on the table. Absolutely no doubt about it. Therefore, we all respect that there is a difference which we have to accept and also respect both. Now, having done that, there are certain issues on which we really rise above all this. For example, take response to Corona itself. In fact, there was a virtual leaders meet, and which resulted in a lot of action on Corona itself. So that has really demonstrated that we can act together. That's another example, which is not today's but a few years ago. The G20 decided to work on some critical parameters on which financial system of the world should really function. And there was a board which was created to deal with it. That will also function well. Then look at some of the issues on which, for example, anti-corruption issues, which our Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been leading light on taking it forward. On that issue again, there has been a lot of global action. Terrorism is another such issue, though the action should be more. But issues like that, today countries are realizing that we must address it together. We may have differences with each other, which they are, but we must address it together. But again, to having said all this, there are certain issues on which there should be more collaboration, which G20 must do it. For example, on climate change. This was the first time in Osaka, we had on climate change, there is a 19+1 formulation, which I don't think should be the case. All 20 should join hands to work on that. But that's the case. So I agree with you that politics will always not allow the full potential of global cooperation to be realized. At the same time, without global cooperation, domestic politics also will not give benefit to the domestic consciency to the extent to which they really need to benefit from global cooperation. For example, vaccine is a good example.
No, I want to share with all of us who are participating today another facet of Mr. Prabhu. He is one of the earliest and loudest voices on climate action. In fact, he had led and steered global parliamentarian groups. He had, in fact, helped create a whole new think tank in India that was focusing on these critical questions. And of course, he has been someone who's always championed for climate action. So my next question is actually based on this facet of yours. As we move to 2022, which is now 14 months away, the Saudi presidency is concluding, the Italian presidency gets underway, and thereafter India starts steering the process. We also have the G7 in the middle. We also have COP26 sometimes in November next year in Glasgow. Do you think it is time for countries like India, Italy, and others to actually put into place a green stimulus that everyone signs on to? Is it time to build back green, build back using technology, build back with SDG agenda as the principal ethic for everyone to embrace? And do you think that moment is right for that?
I don't think we have really choice anymore, because we are really running out of time as far as action is concerned. And we are running out of resources as a global community, because we are using much more than what is available on to this planet. So we really have no choice but to go green, but go fast, because the green light, which then you can cross the signal anywhere in the world. But I think there is now only one sign that you can see, the red sign. So the green is necessary. Otherwise, the red sign is already, nature is already flashing that red sign for a long, long time. So if we are not heading to it, I think we are heading for a real disaster. In fact, if you really look at it, I was just very interestingly, the country which does not necessarily always, there are many voices in the country which support it, but not unequivocally, there's the endorsement of that. Even in the US presidency election, climate change has become a very important issue, which is very heartening to see. And the one of the most state which is going to determine the result of the presidency election, one of the few states, the battleground states, is so that state, in fact, is facing a lot of problems because of climate change. And that is something which is going to create issues for the community, which the community are saying in the election time that we are losing tourism, we are losing our agriculture, we are losing our businesses because of climate change. So this is a realization which has come into the people's mind. So this is something which, therefore, I think this is no longer a choice to see whether we'll go green or we'll not go green. And therefore, I welcome that even presidency election in the United States is now what the important issue on which they're fighting. There have always been some issues. Immigration has been the issue. Issues like that always been the US election issue dominate. But this time, even climate change has become a major issue because people are also realizing it.
No, I guess you are referring to 2 or 3 important states in the US which derive their revenues from energy traditionally, but are today actually battling the impact of climate change. And by the way, even Texas is a very important state which is right on the verge of maybe turning to a different political direction. So let's see. That is for November 3rd, not for the G20. But let me ask you 2 important questions, sir. One is for you. What are the lessons that we have learned from the past, from the Saudi Arabian presidency, from the Japanese, Argentinian, and others who have contributed to the process? What is it that we have learned that countries like Italy and India should embrace in terms of the role and the structure of the G20? And how do we make it more popular amongst the common people? G20 is still seen to be the very wise and intellectual and powerful people's club. How do we make it a more mass organization where young teenagers can send you letters that we are interested in this issue and why don't you take it up? How do we make it more popular amongst the street?
So 2 aspects to what you are speaking. Firstly, we would like to carry forward the good work done by the previous presidencies. That is for sure. Each presidency has put on table some of the very important issues. Like, for example, this time Saudi Arabia talked about land degradation. Japanese talked about the problems of the old, as well as the technology which can address them. So each presidency brings on table a lot of interesting issues. And Saudi Arabia, despite all the challenges, have really been able to focus on the issues very effectively. So we like to carry forward those issues for sure. We're not just going to dump them when India takes over the presidency, but we like to try to work on them, because we feel this is a work in progress, because in 1 year you cannot address all such global issues in the same time. So we have to continue with them. We'll do that. At the same time, India would like to add some of the priorities. Particularly, we feel that the countries which are in the room, the 20 countries, have a responsibility to take care of those who are not in the room. So there are many more countries who are not actually sitting around the table of G20, but we have a responsibility to take care of them. So India would like to work on behalf of all the countries in the world, particularly the most vulnerable ones, vulnerable from economic perspective, vulnerable from social perspective, challenging situation for them from climate perspective, all of them, we like to work with them and try to take this forward. So this is for sure. As far as the specific issue that we like to take forward, exactly the what point that you made, we are trying to get it from people themselves. What do you think should be the issues that G20 should focus on when India is the presidency? Because India is a presidency, holding presidency on behalf of 1.4 billion people. So their voice also has to be reflected and their concerns have to be articulated when we actually take up this presidency. So we are working on that. We are trying to bring together all kinds of stakeholders from different facets, from different spheres, from different backgrounds. And we already started working on that from academics, from scientific community, from social organizations, universities, many of those. And we'll try to therefore form some sort of alliance of all these different institutions, which will feed us into some of these issues and try to give us some advice and guidance, and we like to take it forward. But this is very important. Another part that you just mentioned, and very important aspect, though you mentioned it as a passing, it's a very important issue. See, the G20 is one of the problem of G20 is that it doesn't have a permanent secretariat, which is an advantage. And also because advantage is it provides flexibility. But sometimes the institutional memory, which is necessary, is not necessarily stored into the G20s. Today, OECD is doing a very good job. In fact, my very dear friend, the former senior minister from Mexico, who is now the Director General, in fact, I just spoke to him the other day, and they do a wonderful job, no doubt about it. But still, G20 will have to now, over a period of time, think about how do you make sure that if this institution, this platform has come as one of the important players in the world affairs, then how can we institutionalize that arrangement? Something we'll have to very seriously think over a period of time.
So final question, since we are hosting you under the T20 process, the think tank 20 process, under the Saudi presidency with our partners. My question to you would be, as a G20 Sherpa, how important are organizations that feed into the larger ecosystem, like the W20, the Business 20, the Think Tank 20? How important are these efforts and initiatives for Sherpas and for the policymakers? Are we pleasing ourselves, or are we helping you out in any way?
No, they are extremely important. In fact, their views are very much respected. Their inputs are taken very seriously. In fact, most of the G20 leaders meeting, some of these organizations get an opportunity to come and make a personal presentation. The B20 made a very good presentation even in the last Japanese presidency. So many of them do that. And in fact, on the sidelines of G20 leaders meetings, we always have some of these organizations coming and making the presentation, which are taken into the Friday's leaders meeting also very seriously. In fact, when we have the Sherpa meetings, we also get this feedback from each of these grouping. And when we are trying to prepare, this is what exactly we are in the process of preparing the final leaders statement, we are actually taking those ideas emanating from there as our input and as our strong guiding principles. So I think this is very, very important process. We take them very seriously. And I think without them, I think this will be like we are working in isolation. So we have to be connected with all these important social organizations, social groupings, society at large. And without them, I don't think G20 can ever see that we have the mandate of working on their behalf unless we take their views on board.
So I think that's a very good note to conclude this very in-depth yet small conversation, because we could have asked you so much more. It's a brief conversation because of the format, and we hope we'll be able to talk to you more often in the coming months as we move towards the Indian presidency. But your message is quite clear. G20 has an opportunity to serve humankind as a whole. It is at the forefront of responding to the challenges of our time. We need to think about building capabilities within the G20. We need to think about going green. We need to think about addressing the challenges faced by those who are not on the table. And of course, thank you so much for telling all of us that the work we do at the T20 makes a difference. And we hope what we produce at the outcome of the T20 process will be useful not only for the Saudi Arabian presidency, but will also feed into the Italian and Indian presidency. And so wish you all the best as you join the Troika this December and become part of the steering group for this very important platform that the world has built. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
So welcome to this very...
Thank you very much for the thought-provoking conversation. The points highlighted in the discussion definitely provide us with a segue and resonate across the two panels of today's webinar. It gives me great pleasure to hand over the mic to our moderator for the first panel discussion of the day on building effective systems for a post-COVID world. This panel will be moderated by Dr. James McGann, Senior Lecturer in International Studies and Founder and Director of the Think Tanks and Civil Societies Program at Lauder Institute, University of Pennsylvania. Jim, the floor is yours. Jim, you're on mute. Okay, perfect.
Greetings, everyone. As you know, the T20 Saudi Arabia has established a dedicated task force to discuss how multidisciplinary and multi-sectoral approaches can be used to address the devastating impact of COVID-19 on public health, the economy, markets, and the environment. The goal is to consolidate the best, collect and consolidate the best global thought leadership on recovery and reconstruction. In line with this objective, this morning's webinar, and specifically the session that I'm chairing, will explore immediate and medium-term solutions for economic and social recovery. Before I turn it over to the panelists for their presentations, I want to mention several cross-cutting points as we start the discussion that I think will help knit the disparate presentations that will be made together. One, the disruptive and transformative dimensions of the crisis will have altered and will continue to alter all aspects of our lives and livelihood. The reality is this will have a long-term impact on every aspect of our lives. Secondly, the crisis has become the great accelerator, transformer, and unfortunately terminator, meaning that it has accelerated trends that are already in process. It has transformed and forced the transformation of organizations throughout our societies, and it is the terminator. The reality is, across sectors, 25, 30, maybe even 40% of certain organizations and enterprises that have closed will never reopen. This will have devastating impact and a lasting impact on our communities. Fourthly, those institutions that have taken steps to modernize their operations and implement digital and other strategies are more likely to survive this crisis, and the presentations today point in that direction for those who have and are identifying trends that we all need to take seriously. Higher education, medicine, travel, and leisure, we have already seen the dramatic changes that this crisis has inflicted upon or served to alter and transform those sectors of the economy. Sixth, this crisis and its economic impact is different than past economic downturns, because in the past, the negative impact of the downturn were equally felt by both the rich and those in the middle class. This crisis, the gap between rich and poor has dramatically increased, and those who are poor are more adversely affected and in greater numbers. That will have serious political, economic, and social impact for years to come. Like all great wars, this crisis will create global power shifts, and China seems to be the only country, ironically, that is emerging from this crisis with a commanding position, which is likely to impact geopolitics for years to come. Finally, and most importantly, this is a wake-up call. This crisis is a wake-up call for organizations to accelerate the modernization and reform, if for no other reason, for their very survival may depend on it. Every organization must have as its goal to be smarter, better, faster, and more agile and digital in the years to come. Each of the panelists will have approximately 10 minutes to make their brief summary of their task force recommendations. And I have asked the panelists to make their presentation short and snappy so we have time for some follow-on questions. Our first speaker, and I will dispense with long introductions, is Nasser Bindim, founder of Sharik Society for Health and Community Research. Nasser, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. My presentation will be so brief, maybe around 5 minutes. So I will save you a lot of time. My talk today is about the crossroad between technology, research, and health, and how we can look at it as an integrated part in delivering health services and reducing the burden on the system and the providers, and mainly the governments that provide the healthcare to the public. So we are now in need more than ever to empower individuals to participate more or more actively in their health and healthcare management. We can call this individual's health. The core idea here is similar to the individual psychology that were initiated by psychologists like Alfred Adler and led to the thousands of books about self-help or self-development that we see now everywhere. It's about embedding self-health management within the culture and our day-to-day life. So individual health definition, as I see it, is empowering individuals to control more aspects of their health via, for example, self-diagnostic screening tools, self-help or self-health monitoring, learning and practicing preventative health measures, controlling and improving health behaviors and lifestyle, ideally with an integrated technology and research-driven approach. I spent the last 15 years working on health research automation with the aim to automate rigorous research methodologies. For example, into a simple, smooth electronic systems. Our initial aim was to develop an electronic system that integrates within it the major quantitative research methodology, like cross-sectional design to randomized controlled trials. The system also ideally would control also sample size, sampling techniques, and randomization. So our hope was if we succeeded in that, we can reduce the time, cost, and the learning curve and skills required to execute complex research projects. After achieving this goal, we wanted to integrate the system within health apps and run smoothly as a sub-function or background process in any mobile and web application to collect high-quality research data that will help further improving these apps based on the user experience and outcomes. In 2017, we published the results of one of the first 100% automated randomized control trial for smoking cessation that has been executed in 4 countries. Although the smoking cessation app that we have developed significantly outperformed the control group in helping participants to quit smoking, our major success was in making our research automation system runs without interfering with the user experience or goal of using that application. Since that time, we experimented with many individuals' health apps covering mental health, cardiovascular or heart disease-related health apps, obesity, weight loss, physical activity, and also hand hygiene. For example, in the recent crisis, we developed a Sharik mental health monitoring and screening tool in Arabic language. It's a web-based tool and was used by more than 3 million users across the Arab countries at the peak of time of COVID-19 between May to July only. We know from our previous research that these tools encourage at least 30% to seek mental health consultation with their doctors. And similarly, around 30% will initiate treatment because of that. So as you can see, such tools can catalyze the individual need for action toward their health. So to sum up, there are many questions maybe we can come across later, but to sum up, we need to move from the authoritative health model that sees the individual as hopeless, dependent, who needs an institutionalized help and protection, toward individuals' health, utilizing technology and empowering the individuals to make more control of their own health, to build resilient societies who don't seek healthcare out of panic and fear. So to reduce the impact and the pressure on the system, and allow the system to serve those who are most in need of their health. So health technology now provide a lot of diagnostic tools, very low cost and very effective, comparable to the things that can be done in a hospital. If we trust the individuals to do these things by themselves and take more control of their health management part, then we can reduce the cost and help in recovery, plus building a resilient societies and individuals. Thank you very much.
Answer a few questions since time, you've been so economical in the use of your time. One is, can you talk in terms of the work that you're doing, how COVID-19 has served as an accelerator for the adoption of the digital approaches and the general overall thrust of the work that you're doing? And then secondly, and is connected with that, in a time where there is a discrediting of experts, and you mentioned, the authoritative sort of dimension of health, which we're all familiar with, but what is the role of experts, of doctors, in this model that you have proposed? So one, how has it facilitated, accelerated the adoption of your approach? And then second, what's the role of experts, of doctors and others in the framework that you're establishing?
Definitely. So, for example, similar to what happens in education. So in the past, we look at online education as less effective, maybe ineffective at all. We don't trust the results of online education, but now we are embracing online education and using it for everyone, and start looking at it positively. So similarly, what happens from my experience in mental health, for example, technology. So previously in Saudi Arabia, mental health services cannot be provided in a telemedicine situation. And also insurance companies won't cover telemedicine mental health sessions. All of that has been changed. Now, mental health technology and telemedicine is used. It is covered by the insurance company, and that happened during the last 3 months, all of these improvement and changes. So we are moving also to accept, healthcare professional also moving toward accepting these tools. I will give my patient an app to monitor their mood or mental health status. So I will also help, and it will help me to facilitate and increase the efficiency of the telemedicine session with them, because I know that they are doing their homework and tasks. Similarly, when you look at it as a telemedicine in any other situation, it is more perfectly situated for health behavioral aspects and mental health, but also if we look at it as health monitoring, for example, elderlies, people who need help at home. Before we used to send nurses to visit sick individuals at home. Now we can monitor them remotely with, for example, heart rate monitor, online heart rate monitor devices that will send their data to the hospital. Temperature you can monitor. You can make an ECG, electrocardiogram at home with the small devices and affordable devices, and send it to the doctor to look at it. So now you can save time in diagnostic part when in the patient visit. You can save money and time in transportation, and so you will have more time to concentrate on the case and solving it and identifying the problem, rather than requesting more diagnostics and other stuff. So the individual, as we empower the individual, we will reach a state that we trust what we have learned from the individual and what information we got from these devices and these technologies. is comparable to what we will get if we took this patient to the hospital and run all these tests and waste our time. So that's hopefully that answered both questions.
Yes. And the second, in terms of the role of experts, I mean, in terms of self-help, the notion that one can heal oneself is not applicable in all situations, and in certain conditions, the role of the expert, the role of the doctor is required. So how does what you're proposing relate to that traditional model of medicine?
We could look at it as, again, giving some privileges to the individual and the patient, not necessarily to do the self-healing process, but at least self-screening and self-diagnostic. Now, for example, the Ministry of Health in Saudi Arabia provide a small questionnaire that you can fill up, and that questionnaire will tell you if you need to do a COVID-19 lab test or not. So that will help screen and filter the individuals that want to seek institutionalized help. And by that, we reduce cost and save time and allocate more time and effort to those who need it more. So it is complementary model. It is not giving up the whole control of the system, but it's a complementary model that will help us reduce all the burden that and allow the system to accommodate more real people at need of help. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. The presentation and the follow-up in terms of the questions really clarified the utility and value of what you're doing, and I want to commend you for your efforts and continued success. We now turn to education and to Charlotte Holland, Associate Professor, the Institute of Education, Dublin City University. Charlotte, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. McGann. I'm very pleased to be part of the panel this afternoon. Just a quick shout out to say thanks to everyone behind the scenes, the chair, the coordinator of Task Force 11. They were incredibly supportive over the last few months. I've been asked to speak to, I suppose, the question, how can we build effective education systems that respond to pandemics? And to begin, I just wanted to start by setting the context for some of the things that have been happening that have been quite challenging over the last number of months within the context of education. So we know that the pandemic has disrupted or halted academic studies across the globe. Back in April, UNESCO estimated that in the region of 1.5 billion learners were out of school. So they were affected by the school closures. That constitutes over 90% of the school-age population of learners and close to 100% of those in tertiary settings. To support students during these closures, many schools and tertiary education institutions pivoted to delivering education through distant modes of learning, mainly using, for example, the internet, television, radio. And a key issue there, almost immediately felt by many people, was the issue of a lack of universal access to the broadband, the Wi-Fi technologies, or indeed the computer infrastructure that's needed to support learning, for example, through the internet. In addition to this, using television and radio, it doesn't necessarily lead to quality learning. They're broadcast media. The degree to which you can interact with learning that is being communicated through the television or through radio is much more limited than that which you would experience in a school setting or using web technologies. Again, concerns were raised about the inadequate training and preparation of both educators and learners for learning across mixed modes of learning. So this transitioning from engaging in learning in an in-school context and then moving beyond that to engaging remotely. Teachers really weren't prepared for that. Teaching through technology is very different to teaching with technology. And what we noticed almost immediately was that the professional development that we provide our teachers with is primarily focused on the latter. In other words, it was focused very much on how to use technology to facilitate learning. Therefore, teachers weren't appropriately trained in how to communicate through this new medium. And that in itself is a significant challenge and something that we need to look to as we move forward. Other issues that emerged over the last couple of months, and some of those much longer, are issues of e-safety, but particularly online. We've had cases where meetings, there have been breaches of security, for example, during online learning classes and so on. And teachers and parents have real concerns about the privacy, about protecting privacy and e-safety of children. On top of this, many parents had to engage in remote working. And with children in the home, that became quite difficult to manage. Parents were expected now not only to work in the home, but also to act in loco teachers, in place of teachers. And some parents were able to, for example, facilitate that. Some had the skill set to do that. However, many parents didn't. And the different levels and quality of support from parents in the home inevitably result in very different learning experiences. So unfortunately, the evidence that's emerging is pointing to significant learning losses, particularly for those who are already experiencing disadvantage. Furthermore, it's important to note that schools are not just a locus of learning. They are spaces where children and young adults come together to socialize. There are places where children sometimes get fed. And the disruption to the delivery of in-school education has disrupted those other processes that happen within the context of schools. And the World Bank, for example, estimated that 360 million children were impacted by the disruption to the school's nutrition program globally, and are also very concerned about, particularly about girls and young women who may be suffering from mental health and well-being issues because they're in isolation and suffering hardship in the home. In addition to this, parents, educators, and educational providers were concerned, and have some concern still, about the lack of preparedness for the return to school, for this transitioning back towards in-school or in-person education. So they're concerned about inadequate protocols in place to ensure the health and safety of their children, and the resourcing that's needed to appropriately protect the health and well-being of all. And finally, as we look forward, there are concerns about, obvious concerns about the finances of governments as we move forward. There are likely to be issues in maintaining public funding of education. And within that context, we need to look to see where priorities may be made. So in summary, the issues that I want to speak about in terms of addressing are these issues of unequal access to technology, the lack of readiness of teachers, learners, school systems for remote education, the learning losses, the health and safety concerns, and the financial uncertainty at all school levels as we move forward. So the brief that myself and my co-authors, which is Dalal Al-Dagheether, Abdul Ghaffar Mughal, and Mohammed Nuran Abi, we put this together. It was published last Friday. This particular brief highlights 8 recommendations for the G20 as we move forward to build effective education systems, to build back better systems that are more responsive in times of need, such as pandemics. And the first recommendation is really the most obvious, And Dr. McGann noted in his summary at the very beginning, he talked about the acceleration, the need to accelerate particular actions as we move forward. The very first action we need to accelerate is universal access to broadband and technology, because remote schooling or remote education using web technologies or internet-based technologies cannot happen unless there is appropriate access to broadband and other technologies. We also need to remember that non-technological solutions can be very useful as well. So we need to think in advance about how to place learning resources within communities that can be distributed in times of need. As governments, we need to implement action plans to manage transitions and continuity of learning beyond the classroom. And some suggestions for within the action plan include accelerated training for teachers at all levels on how to engage in quality teaching, learning, and assessment at a distance. And part of this process will involve looking at the content that we're currently delivering, and certainly at a governmental level, to see what aspects of the curriculum could be curated, could be perhaps emphasized, what aspects could be set aside during emergency transitions to remote learning. And also examine whether we could build micro modules to support basic education, basic literacy and numeracy, and micro credentials to go with those. We also need seriously to look at the issue of assessment. We've seen the drama and some disasters in not being able to run high stakes exams at the end of, in the past couple of months. The UK had particular difficulties there. Here in Ireland, we also had our challenges. So the challenge is that teachers are flying blind unless they can get some feedback loop to understand how learners are performing while they're engaging in remote education. So we need to look at curricula, we need to seriously look at assessment and think about how continuous assessment could be introduced so that learners can, so that feedback relay is there. Also importantly, we need to support parents. If this continues, if home is to be a site of learning, we need to seriously consider providing advice and support for parents in the broad domain of care, stimulation, play, enabling learning within the home. This has been called upon by UNICEF amongst others. And just coming up to the final points here, we need to look at how we can provide better training on e-safety. We need to look to see how we can provide mental health supports for our learners. And just a final point I want to make is that a key learning from this pandemic is that access to in-person, in-school education is important. Therefore, we must strive to keep schools open as soon as the local transmission of a COVID pandemic or other disaster is under control. The alternative, according to the head of the UN, Antonio Guterres, is a generational catastrophe where gains in expanding access to quality education are likely to be stalled or reversed. And that's something that we really do not want to let happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlotte, very much. Just two quick questions. One is that most school districts, most systems are large, bureaucratic, and not agile. And COVID obviously has posed a challenge for all institutions to be more agile and responsive. And then secondly, the issues around how kids now receive information is fundamentally different, largely digital, and the sort of mismatch between the lack of preparedness of most of the school districts in terms of how to train, how to provide teachers with the skills to teach online, even though this has been the transformation of how information and learning transmitted has been in play for a number of times. And as I've said previously, it's the big accelerator. So is it possible, I mean, in terms of now an environment now and in the future, where school districts will have to be much more adaptive, much more agile and responsive and resilient? Are they capable of that? And two, how do we get teachers? And I get feedback from my daughter and my students about disasters in terms of online learning. And so how do we really make this radical transformation given the lack of agility and responsiveness of most school systems?
Okay, thank you for two very interesting and important questions. I think I'll deal with the latter first, if I may, and that is, you know, how do we get teachers acclimatized to using digital technologies in their teaching and learning, but also comfortable and use them appropriately in terms of remote learning. The key there, I think one important advantage we have now is that I would imagine most teachers now have at least had the experience of engaging with learners online. The fact that that experience may not have been a quality one is sad for the learners, but nevertheless, it gives us something as, for example, teacher educators, anyone involved in teacher professional development, it gives us a basis from which we can build up a skill set. So I think part of the solution here is that we work with what teachers have experienced. We now know that they know how to turn on computers, they can access Zoom, and they do understand the challenges, you know, of engaging learners in an online mode. So I think really it's up to the higher education sector, the government, the ministries of education and countries to look at what's there, to examine it critically, and to start really accelerating in-service teacher education programs to show teachers how to do this very quickly. In Ireland, they're doing some of that through a professional development service. They're already out there delivering in schools through Zoom, and they're finding that their classes are full. All teachers are signing up for it. I imagine that is the case in other countries. In terms of the bureaucratic nature of school districts, I think that is a problem. But I have watched here in Ireland, we have less of a problem with that bureaucracy at a local level here in Ireland, because a lot of our schools are autonomous, you know, and so we have a good degree of control. But we have other structures that have in the past been quite bureaucratic. And what we've noticed is that the learning in having to respond quickly over the last 6 months has definitely translated into much more effective communication and management systems. So I would be hopeful that the learning that all ministries, government departments have had, which translates into the administration in school districts, that learning would enable them to see that we don't have the time to wait for them to catch up. Certainly digital technologies will be useful in that, digital training for administrators and those involved in decision making, but ultimately it's something we would have to work on together.
Thank you very much. We now have Nicholas Bouchard, the Task Force 3 co-chair, Global Solutions Fellow, and President of Grand Paris Alliance. Many have, in terms of major urban areas, which is your focus, have fled to the suburbs. An unprecedented number of city dwellers are purchasing houses outside of cities. So in your overall comments, I would appreciate your addressing that, since this has been your lifelong concern in Paris. Nicholas.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Jim. I hope the sound is okay, right?
The sound is fine.
Okay, thank you very much. We have been working quite hard in preparing for the session and sort of trying to understand how cities were playing a positive or a negative role in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. And I'm very thankful to T20 Saudi Arabia for both setting up this special task force on COVID-19, but also taking the trouble, I would say, to include this variable of cities, which is typically associated with local challenges, risks, and governance in the context of the G20, which is global. This just added a little bit more work on our plate, right? But this was also collective, and I must here thank the co-authors of the paper which we delivered for this task force, for Mike Cohen from the New School, and Susan Parnell from African Center for Cities, and Holger Kühl from GIZ, and Raja Al-Marzouki, the chair of the Task Force on Infrastructure Investments. Reason why I'm mentioning that here is three things, and I would just like to quickly share my screen. Yes, if it works.
Yeah, there we go. It's fine.
Yeah. In our view, we cannot go back to normal, and cities are part of this transformative equation. And we had the Sherpa of India just minutes ago, right? And in his very interesting and insightful approach, there is this element which was not quoted. He mentioned that nothing which is local is just local now. It is connected. But I would say cities are part of a more thorough transformational context. And I want to highlight here the fact that the crisis of the COVID-19 is a very asymmetric crisis. This is a term that has been coined by OECD, but asymmetric for two reasons: because cities are the epicenter of the crisis, but they are not the decision makers. There are still like country institutions or international institutions. And furthermore, it's not just cities as a local level against a sort of a global decision-making level. It's the crisis is also asymmetric because nowhere in the world, be it in Europe or in the US or in India, in Saudi Arabia, or etc., the crisis is hitting cities equally, right? In cities, there are boroughs, there are neighborhoods which are hit by the crisis far more than others. And this, if it is not being taken into account, and we just have the traditional sets of global tools and global solutions, then we will miss a point. The other thing I would like to highlight, as we cannot go back to normal, is that we do find signs of structural transformation. The World Bank has highlighted in its last report, which was just edited just a couple of days ago, that we are witnessing a return of poverty, right? There has been a slowdown in poverty alleviation since 2015, but we are witnessing since the outburst of the COVID now a couple of months ago, it will soon be nearly a year ago, right? A return of mass poverty and a return of extreme hunger. And it seems that we are at the end of a cycle that started roughly 30 years ago, if you want to put it after the end of the Cold War in terms of growth, economic growth, or even 40 years ago in the mid 70s for some reasons. And it's very interesting, if you allow me, Jim, just to highlight those three things. We are practically 50 years after the vote of the United Nations General Assembly. I put the date here, October 24, 1970, of the official development assistance from developed nations to poor nations, this 0.7% aid to foreign nations. And just a few years afterwards, the Club of Rome issued the Limits to Growth report. And then there was the oil crisis, then the first Habitat Summit. I mean, it's as if the understanding of the world, which was about to change 30, 40 years ago, now we are in it. And for this reason, think it's just possible to say, let's go back to normal, build back better, because in this equation, cities have played a tremendous role. And because of that, probably also the G20 is at crossroads. Of course, the last 15, 20 years, 30 years has been a tremendous acceleration of global economic integration. And this has yielded growth, right? Undoubtedly. And it has been supported by urbanization and integrated infrastructure systems. If in the growth story of the last 20 years, you forget urbanization as both a catalytic parameter and something which has been triggered by economic globalizations as we know it, then we forget something. In the context of a degraded multilateral order with the acceleration of large-scale environmental and social transformations, I think it's very important that we do question the coming months to come, but also in preparation of the upcoming set of the G20 and the presidency of Saudi Arabia, that the responses that have been provided after the 2008 financial crisis by the G20 have been the securing of the global banking system, which has obviously tremendously important, but also a systematic questioning of the role of social expenditures and probably a lack of understanding of the need to secure, I would say, the building of social capital at the same of securing the banking system. And why I'm saying that here, is because 2008 financial crisis is at the moment when the world sort of became more urban than rural. This shift in the beginning of the millennium, and consistently cities have been absent of equation of major financial players. If you look at the IMF report, the Global Economic Outlook has just been also a few days ago, right? If you look in this big report, how much time cities or communities or urban infrastructure are quoted, you will be very disappointed because there is practically no quote. And if the G20 doesn't build on this changing rationale, then it will consistently miss the point. And this is something that the more you look at it, the more understand that you need a multidisciplinary approach to complex problems, but also you need to have a multi-scale approach to complex problems. And it's not a question of zooming in or out. It's really a question of finer grain approach to problem solving and frameworks. So if you want to think about some solutions and the way forward, then we would argue it's not about building back better, it's about building forward better, and this is different. It's about changing the pre-COVID-19 status quo and understanding that if we do not cope through redesigned international cooperation and multilateral relations, as the G20 Sherpa from India mentioned, especially through the G20, for example, with urban welfare at the core of prosperity, then the foundations of any recovery will be partial and will be fragile. If we want to move forward, and I would very much agree with Charlotte on that regard when she quoted the education issues, we need work and capacity to be more, and there are very promising ways to think about moving forward with an of well-being. For me, it's not just a question of green investments or taking more climate change into account. It's really an economy of well-being as the core of a new sustainable economy. It's something which is been looking at, sure, EIA. We will have the president of EIA later today. The G20 Italy, he will have, as a follow-up of G20 Saudi Arabia and before G20 India, I would say a historic responsibility in not just using recipes in the immediate past, but thinking about the way forward. Also reviewing the articulation of the SDGs and the Agenda 2030. There are many pushes. Let's use the Agenda 2030 multilateral to address different set of issues altogether. Yes and no. when you see that as compared with 2015, no return of poverty, I was mentioning it, return of hunger, etc., we cannot just use the framework of the as it is to think about infrastructure as priority and which priorities of the SDGs should be brought up, first. The last point I would like to highlight, if you give me one last minute, Jim, is what we mentioned in the policy brief for the special task force. We are continuously working on that, is this question of a G20 urban platform for recovery. So it might sound a bit big or fuzzy, but in fact, we cannot be specific at this time, because in G20 there is practically nothing regarding this. Of course, it's the U20 engagement group, but if you look at the development working group, the infrastructure working group, the finance working group, the Sherpas meetings, cities at this urban scale are still very much absent. What we say is that starting with issues of infrastructure investments, but also connecting with capacity buildings and well-being, there should be such a platform in the G20 for years to come to aggregate different components, to articulate quality and sustainable infrastructure with the reinforcement of social welfare capacities, but also to revise the way about through which local priorities are incorporated into international financial institutions development assistance. I was mentioning this 0.7% development assistance back from the early 70s. And there would be no reason why, in the context of today, which there is far more wealth on the globe, right, and far more ability than back in the 70s, there should not be an ability, especially from the wealthiest countries of the world, to shape something that would be equivalent to what was decided for 50 years ago, but addressing the real needs and the real organization of today's world, which is not just about countries and international institutions, but also about dozens of thousands or hundreds at least of cities of 500,000 inhabitants or more. And there are, again, very encouraging and strong pushes, including through the T20, to review how we do measure social development. And whenever you go in these directions, you see you cannot bypass the local level, you cannot bypass the cities, but you can also see that how much we need to refine that, so that apart from being something we talk about, it becomes something that can be jointly structured and organized.
Nicholas, you'll need to wrap up here.
Yeah, and I think I'm good with that.
Okay, great. I now turn with the remaining time to Axel Mikolova, a senior founding partner of Perspectives Climate Group. Axel?
Yes, if you allow me to share the screen, it would be great. Perfect. So let's get this going. Thank you. So I'm really happy to talk here on the policy brief on ensuring that COVID recovery actually supports transformation to a climate neutral society. I thank my co-authors from CAPSARC and University of Berkeley and other institutions. So it was a really global effort. And I would really like to stress that we see an unprecedented willingness of governments to spend trillions on recovery from the pandemic. And of course, we now see the pandemic drags on, and it is getting more difficult to actually resolve its effects. And the big challenge that we see is the risk of locking in technologies that have high greenhouse gas emissions. We've seen it previously in the context of the 2008-2009 financial crisis. There was a lot of talk that recovery should be green, but actually that recovery was mostly brown. And that's clear because the policymakers want to act very quickly, and quick action usually rewards the mature technologies that have high emissions. And the T20 work stream and the G20 presidency of Saudi Arabia has focused on circular carbon economy. And of course, the question is now, how can the recovery be consistent with those principles? So we have 6 recommendations to G20 in our policy brief. And the first one would be to invest in people instead of fuels. Subsidy removal, that has been talked about for many years. It has not really come forward, but now the crisis is an opportunity, and the removal of fossil fuel subsidies would allow to free resources for labor increasing alternatives to fossil fuel use. You see the solar power plant, for example, and the G20 would be an ideal vehicle to move this forward. The second pillar relates to those subsidies that are now being discussed to accelerate consumption of certain goods. In many countries, people talk about, for example, car acquisition subsidies. And such programs, of course, risk to lock in the high carbon technologies. So for any of those programs, G20 would be an ideal platform to coordinate that, be it vehicles, be it household appliances or buildings, that the technologies should be focused on low carbon action, and that can be supported by bulk procurement programs for those technologies that then generate cost reductions. The third pillar, and I think that today's event is a very nice illustration of that, is to actually work productively and not waste time through traveling. And we've seen now, and I think that was one of the most productive effects of the crisis to date, that collaboration globally can function in a virtual manner. And of course, it needs to be perpetuated to prevent that once the crisis is over, everybody falls back into the same behavior as before. So we need tax incentives for equipment of software, and the gap, of course, has been noted previously. We need to reduce the incentives that many countries give for commuting and business travel. And of course, referring to Charlotte's presentation, we need a rollout of modern technologies that allow real homeschooling and not just trying to patch up problems there. The fourth pillar relates to tourism. Of course, tourism is a mainstay of the economy of many small countries, small island states, for example. But tourism is very emissions intensive. So now to build back better, we should promote high value tourism. And there are certain examples like Bhutan and the Seychelles that have shown that with a small number of tourists, you can generate really a lot of revenues. So the G20 would be an ideal place to coordinate regulation for travel service providers with regard to calculation of their carbon footprints, with regard to being transparent on the emissions they generate, and of course, the requirement to offset remaining greenhouse gas emissions. The fifth pillar relates to land transport, because land transport has been one of the most difficult sectors to transform towards low carbon structure. And of course, now we have here the opportunity to work together with trends that we are currently seeing. Actually, in another task force, I was also co-leading a policy brief on green and blue hydrogen strategies. And that's an emerging technology where, of course, the infrastructure investment is very important to get it going. And also, of course, with those infrastructures, often you have the problem there is a lot of funding very early on, but then there's the so-called valley of death. And this valley of death needs to be overcome by joint engagement, and the recovery programs would be ideal for that. And last but not least, the sixth pillar, we have a lot of smart technologies in space. And these technologies can serve to do real-time monitoring of key variables that both relate to public health and climate. One knows now that the COVID pandemic is particularly problematic in areas with high local air pollution. And so this initiative could enable to really address these challenges on the ground. So I hope that our policy brief gives sufficient food for thought for the policymakers to actually bring in these aspects in the recovery programs. And I hope that the G20 presidency of Saudi Arabia, but also of Italy and India, these are all countries that have engaged on climate policy quite strongly, particularly India, and that this stream now will be brought into the recovery in the next couple of years. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to any questions you may have.
All right. What I'd like in terms of the limited remaining time we have, to ask each of the panelists to provide a specific example in their respective areas of health, education, urban policy, and the environment, how institutions or an institution as a best practices example has become smarter, better, faster, more agile, and more digital in response to the crisis we face. So can we start from the top? Nasser?
Yes.
Leave with some concrete, specific examples where there are best practices that have emerged as a result of this crisis, and where institutions are prepared and have met this crisis in a commanding way.
Yes, again, I'm looking at the different example that has been done by the Ministry of Health in Saudi Arabia, providing online services and screening tools to the public, so that will reduce the burden and it will reduce the needs for the people to go out and seek help in the hospitals. In the past, we used to have a lot of people going to the emergency room for minor conditions like headache, sinus allergy, and all sorts of minor health issues. Now that has been changed, it's totally changed, that people now look for the alternatives, look for using health monitoring practices. Another example, many people in the past book an appointment in the hospitals to go to check their blood pressure, for example, or to do a follow-up for their blood pressure. Now, you can measure your blood pressure at home, send it to a healthcare practitioner online via lots of applications, some governmental application by the Ministry of Health, and consult with them. So you don't need to go out of your home and seek health help. An advantage of that we don't realize on outside the health scope is that this reduced traffic jams. I used to work at the Saudi.
Thank you. I just want to be able to get to the others before we conclude. So quickly, Charlotte, Nicholas, and Axel.
Okay, so I'll jump in here. So from the context of education, I think here in Ireland, the Ministry of Education, the Department of Education and Science, has vastly improved its communication structure by using technology. So for example, school principals are contactable through WhatsApp. You know, the messaging is available day or night, and it's working. And within their training departments, they're rolling out on-demand training for teachers through their professional development service. So for me, there are two examples at a local level.
Wonderful. Nicholas, quickly.
Yeah, there would be thousands of examples in cities.
Okay, we need just one.
Across the globe, yeah, but what I'm saying here is that it's about food distribution. It is about supporting the poorest of the poor in communities, but it's also giving support to informal workers. And you can see solutions arising in Saudi Arabia, in India, in Milano, in Paris, wherever. So it's not a good way to think about best practices that can be duplicated. It's necessary to look at what's happening and what is happening now in cities and in communities.
Okay, that's
And
wonderful.
that,
We must conclude.
James, just let me finish with that. And that
Quickly.
it has to be consolidated. It has to be consolidated globally.
Okay, Axel?
Yes, let me give one example from my own institution, Perspectives Climate Research. We are supporting many developing countries. In the past, we used to have at least 20 intercontinental flights every year. Now we have this year only one intercontinental flight. Still, we are able through online media to communicate with people in Africa, in Asia. And I think we will try to keep this that way when the pandemic is over. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you to all of the panelists. And I want to underscore the extraordinary work of the Saudi T20 and G20 in what one can only describe the most difficult of circumstances, how you have, from the beginning, organized very successfully and seamlessly an inclusive process of institutions around the world. And I want to commend you and thank all of the panelists for their wonderful presentation. I turn it back now to the chair.
Thank you, Jim, and members of the panel for the important insights. We now turn to the next panel on multi-stakeholder approaches for a post-COVID world. Mr. Akshay Mathur, Director at the Observer Research Foundation in Mumbai, will be moderating this panel. Akshay, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I welcome my fellow panelists, and I welcome all the viewers to this webinar today. The last webinar of the T20 Summit season on Task Force 11. This particular session is titled Multi-Stakeholder Approaches for a Post-COVID World. We are partnering with the Saudi Arabian T20 Secretariat to for this particular panel discussion, as well as for this entire webinar today. May I now get a chance to, can I get a chance to now invite and welcome my fellow panelists? So thank you very much. Thank you very much. So welcome Professor Danny Bradler, welcome Professor Mohammad Khurram, welcome Dr. Muhammad Al-Rajeh, and of course, a very warm welcome to Shloka Nath. Thank you very much for joining us. The way we will structure this session today is that we will have 20 minutes of opening remarks by my fellow panelists, and then 20 minutes or so of moderated discussion, which I will lead. If there are questions that come through to me from the organizers through the different channels on which this is being broadcasted, Zoom, YouTube, then I will curate those questions, and I will also intersperse them with some of the remaining questions that I have. With that, let's begin with this session. I just want to make a quick introductions, the full introductions. You've seen the designations online, and you can look them up online as well on the T20 website. I want to start with Shloka. She is currently the Executive Director of the India Climate Collaborative and also a Senior Executive with Tata Trusts. Tata's, as some of you may know, is one of India's largest multinationals, but it also runs one of India's largest, if not the largest foundation, which deals with a lot of sustainability issues on economic development, social development, and environment. So Shloka, welcome. I'd like to welcome Professor Danny Bradler. He's been writing on multilateral issues and studying multilateral issues for a very long time. I had the chance and pleasure of following you from a distance. His work is is not foreign to any one of us, especially not in the Think 20 circuit. So welcome. I'd like to welcome Dr. Al-Rajeh. He is a neurologist with the Al Habib Medical Center based in Riyadh. He's currently with Northwestern University. We look forward to hearing your comments. Welcome.
Hi.
And lastly, a warm welcome to Professor Muhammad Khan. You are a professor of cybersecurity at the Center of Excellence at the King Saud University, and you've been leading multiple cyber studies for the university, as well as for different think tanks that are based all over the world, including one based in the United States. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Akshay.
With that, I will give a chance to all the panelists to start with 5-minute opening remarks. I just want to tell all our viewers that the only guideline for this session that was sent to the speakers and that we have set for this session is that, as the title indicates, we are trying to explore multi-stakeholder approaches for a post-COVID world. And there's a reason why we selected this topic. The last session that was just curated and moderated by Jim was on multi-stakeholder systems. What we want to look at now is multi-stakeholder approaches. And the reason why we have these eminent panelists is because they have dealt with multi-stakeholder approaches in their own way, either locally, nationally, or internationally. And they come from different fields. There's healthcare, there's cybersecurity, there's climate, and of course, also international and financial institutions. So we would like you all to focus on how we can study the different multi-stakeholder approaches. What are some of the learnings of multi-stakeholder approaches in your own experience? Those experiences could be local, they could be national or international, but we want to see how they have worked. What are some of the challenges and what are some of the benefits, and how we can apply them to a post-COVID world, specifically in the context of G20. Maybe we can take away some recommendations for the G20 leaders. So with that, what I would like to do is I'd like to start with Shloka. She is based out of Mumbai, India. And Shloka, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Akshay, for inviting me to speak with you today on multi-stakeholder approaches for tackling global problems post-COVID. It's a great honor and a wonderful opportunity to share with you all some measure of our journey in building the India Climate Collaborative and some of those lessons for multi-stakeholder approaches. So in October 2017, when I first came on board to build out the sustainability focus for the Tata Trust, which, as Akshay mentioned, is one of India's oldest and largest social philanthropic organizations, one imperative became fairly clear fairly quickly to us, which was we needed to build the Indian climate ecosystem. Specifically, how might we galvanize Indian domestic funders to act on climate change? At the time, climate-focused philanthropic funding in India was very low, only a tiny fraction of the total philanthropic funding in the country. And the Indian climate movement lacked the support and involvement of Indian philanthropy. We realized very quickly that the full potential of philanthropy was going to require a collective approach. Efforts on climate change were uncoordinated, individual philanthropies were at different places in their climate journey, and learnings were unevenly distributed. So the ICC was really created to enable broad-based, collective, coordinated climate action. We believe in the power of many. If you are going to move from the act of giving to solving, then philanthropy can no longer be a solitary activity. No single actor, no matter how large, has the capacity to take on complex socio-economic development challenges. And the key benefits of a collaborative are really to mitigate individual risk, to be greater than the sum of its individual parts, and to enable ideas and missions to scale. So with this in mind, the ICC works at the nexus of business, government, research, and civil society, using philanthropy as a conduit to enable action. We play a very unique role as a convener and as a connector. Since collaboration is so critical to our mission, we create opportunities for our networks of partners and other organizations that we know to come to the same table. We landscape climate sectors to drive attention and resources to underfunded sectors and organizations. And perhaps the most important, we use our platform to elevate climate actors. Collaboration can amplify collective existing voices and develop future leaders to tell the story of India through the lens of Indian institutions, individuals, and communities. And we're realizing in our country, like many of you are in yours, that we live in a finite world. Ultimately, we depend on the natural world for every mouthful of food that we eat, and indeed every lungful of air that we breathe. And today, due to the resulting global crises from the COVID-19 pandemic, we are also witnessing the momentous confluence of time and possibilities. The time is now, more so than it has ever been. There is a confluence of opportunity, of capability, as well as the need for global cooperation and multi-stakeholder approaches to solving the world's problems, which makes it the perfect time to take the quantum leap forward. And so one of the opportunities that I can sense immediately at this point is around green recovery. And it feels difficult to have a conversation about going green at a time when people are going through such economic hardships. This discomfort, however, comes from a very long perpetuated false binary that climate and development goals are different. The truth is that climate action calls for efficient, equitable, clean, and sustainable processes that mitigate economic and social risks. And so when we deprioritize our climate goals under the guise of economic hardship, we only export these risks to the near future. And one more destabilizing global crisis at this scale is something that this planet can just not afford. So for me, when you speak of a re-emerging and resilient global economy, this is really about transitioning who we are, the very foundation of us as nation states. We've been forced into this transitional phase due to this pandemic, and how we choose to come out of it, what are the decisions we want to lead with. It's imperative that we don't lock ourselves into a high carbon future and rather focus on building a low carbon, sustainable future instead. This is true for much of the developed as well as the developing world. And this is really where global partnerships or collaboration plays a crucial role. It allows a diverse set of actors to work together in developing resilient economies by supporting existing policies, programs, and to demonstrate that we are ready and willing to shift gears to a greener future. And global forums such as these are a crucial means of building the case and gathering multiple stakeholders for climate policies. India has repeatedly called for global cooperation in dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. And as an influential member of several leading world forums, from the G20 to the WHO, the upcoming COP26, India has an opportunity to push for a new economic development model premised on low carbon emissions, climate resilience, and sustainable and inclusive pathways, as well as to seek international cooperation in addressing the deeply embedded vulnerabilities of our economies to future risks. The economic decline due to the COVID-19 crisis presents India as well as the rest of the developed and developing world with a rare glimpse of the magnitude of transformations required in the coming decade to deal with the other looming threat, climate change. Hopefully, this is a message we can all present to the world of how stronger climate actions could be successfully aligned with development imperatives. And finally, collaboration, multi-stakeholder approaches, these are the lighthouses to shift conversations, to bring people together in a direction towards positive change. This is the regeneration which has to take root in our societies. And in order to address some of the largest, most complex global challenges that face us today, there is nothing more difficult yet more gratifying in our society than living with sincerity and acting from a place of large-hearted, rational faith in the human spirit, continually bending towards growth and betterment. This remains the most potent antidote to cynicism. And today, especially, we see global collaboration as an act of courage and faith in our ability to solve the world's problems together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Look. I'm going to come back to you with some questions. May I now move to Dr. Muhammad Al-Rajeh for your opening remarks.
Hello, hi. Well, thank you for having me. I hope you can hear me very well.
We can, sir. You have 5 minutes, yes.
Oh, sure. So just to start rolling on business, I start by noting that the 21st century has been marked by technological advances and world hyperconnectivity. Sadly, the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated how much the global health system is actually fragile. As we have heard and known for years, all governments are committed to protecting their citizens' health. Indeed, according to the World Health Organization, it estimated that about $7.8 trillion was spent on hospitals, clinical infrastructure, healthcare worker salaries, and other healthcare-related expenditures, and that was in 2017. Over the years, this was met with calls and endeavors to cut costs, boost healthcare quality metrics, and improve the system of pharmaceutical drugs. And so these governments created a myriad of controls. Though each country, in its good nature for their citizens, believes that its control will protect its people, reduce its healthcare costs, and shield its local industries from international competition, and contribute to self-sufficiency. The overall complexity of each country implementing controls results in significant barriers to access life-saving drugs and treatments around the globe. And so we need to point out that even prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, import restrictions on medical equipment were already high, particularly in less developed countries, suggesting a general trend towards self-reliance rather than international collaboration. And since the COVID-19 outbreak, the production of medical goods has taken further center stage and demonstrated that the countries are highly dependent on each other. Even for the simpler medical goods, trade barriers present major obstacles to meeting sudden spikes in demand. And I'd note an example that not even face masks are necessarily manufactured independently. Even China, the largest producer of face masks, requires a filter component that is sourced from fabrics manufacturers located in countries such as Germany and Canada. We have known and seen in our own eyes that export bans interrupt trade routes and results in firms assisting local governments in building stockpiles for essential goods. As smaller, less developed countries cannot ramp up their production capacities by quickly repurposing already existing manufacturing capacities, this strategy affected them far more adversely than other countries. Because cross-border supply chains have been so much disrupted during the COVID-19 pandemic, given that more than 50 nations were restricting their exports of certain medical supplies at the first few weeks of this pandemic, this has led to the World Trade Organization description of trade in medical products as critical and in severe shortage. So I note that the chairman of the G20, the 2020 G20, the custodian of the two holy mosques, King Salman of Saudi Arabia, has called for, and I quote, an effective and coordinated response to this pandemic, and to, and I quote again, restore confidence in the global economy. In our policy brief that we have presented, we argue that global value chains offer solutions to supply shortages that the group of 20, G20, must take the lead for safeguarding production in global value chains, focusing on essential industries in not only healthcare, but also in food supply, as that too was affected during this pandemic. Therefore, we have proposed key policy actions to enhance the robustness of production systems for both healthcare-related global value chains and food-related global value chains by reducing trade costs and increasing multilateral cooperation. It is essential to build on the efforts and determination of the G20 leaders, aiming at the international coordination of economic policy that can provide the fertile ground to grow globally coordinated mechanisms to meet challenges of globalization and hyperconnectivity in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. And that's it.
Thank you very much, and thank you for sticking to the time limit as well. We've heard about some of the multi-stakeholder approaches on climate that Shloka just explained, and now your perspective on trade and what is happening with respect to the multilateralism and in healthcare supply chains. Let's move now to Professor Danny Bradler, who has written about some of these multilateral institutions. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Akshay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you all right. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Great, thanks. And thank you to CAPSOC and the organizers for inviting me. What I want to do in my 5 minutes is to use the time to talk about two examples of multi-stakeholder groups that we discussed in our policy brief on multilateralism that I think lead to some outcomes or some suggestions for the G20, and which I'm talking from having participated both as a scholar and as an active participant. The first one I want to discuss is the independent accounting at the Multilateral Bank. Those of you who don't know, all of the multilateral banks, beginning with the World Bank, have what's called an IAM, which is an independent mechanism. That means independent of the management of the organization, reporting to the board, that investigates complaints by communities who claim they've been harmed by the operations of the bank because they funded projects and failed to comply with their own operational policies and standards. Beginning in the late 1980s, it became clear that multilateral development bank policies and multilateral development banks in their project lending were not functioning the way they were anticipated to function when they were originally set up after the Bretton Woods Agreement, in that they were interacting directly with communities in their borrower countries, and that as a result, they were having impacts on those communities that often were harmful to the community. Some of you may remember the World Bank's problems with the Narmada Dam project in India, or the Transmigration project in Indonesia. And so that in environmental issues, resettlement, cultural property, a whole range of issues, they were causing serious harm, and the banks could not be held accountable for that. And it was harm that they should be held accountable because it was the bank that was responsible, not the borrower country itself. So beginning in the late 1980s, early 1990s, informal multi-stakeholder groups, which never into a coherent organizational structure, but operated in parallel with each other, but to produce a result. This was civil society groups, some of the executive directors at the World Bank, some academics, officials in the multilateral institutions, and governments realized that they needed to do something to improve the accountability of the bank. And working together, they created what at that point was the first institution that allowed an international organization to be held directly accountable by non-state citizens. And they created the inspection panel. Since that time, so over the last 26 or 27 years, all the multilateral development banks have created these mechanisms, including the AIIB and the BRICS New Development Bank. And private lenders have created what are called the Equator Principles, which serve a similar sort of function. It's important to note that these institutions have added great value to the mechanism, or to the development bank, because as we all know, when these banks fund projects in countries, they're ambitious projects, complicated projects operating in very complex, dynamic environments, where it is inevitable that the projects are being funded by the banks with imperfect knowledge. And so the risk of making mistakes, no matter how competent and professional everybody is, and I'm not suggesting for a minute that they're not acting at the highest level of competence, but that it's inevitable mistakes will be made, and that they need a mechanism for learning from those mistakes and being able to correct them and to compensate anyone who is disproportionately and unintentionally harmed by those projects. And the accountability mechanisms are the only mechanisms that allow that to happen, because they are initiated by the people who've actually been harmed by the project. And there are many examples one can point to where the bank has ended up with a better funded project as a result of this. So the lesson I would take from this, can you imagine if the WHO or the IMF had such a mechanism going into this crisis, allowing communities to speak up and to say to the WHO, we need some more insight, more investigation, more adjustments to deal with the pandemic. So out of that first example, I would say the recommendation to the G20 should be that all national organizations should be creating independent accountability mechanisms to enhance their lending learn function. Is number one. Number two, the second example is the example of sovereign debt. As we know, many countries at the moment are in debt distress, and the expectation is that over the next year or 2 years, a significant number of, particularly in Africa, but in other parts of the world, are likely to experience debt problems. And the debt situation is different now from what it was in the past, because there are new lenders. As we know, China has become a very significant lender, both as an official creditor and in private commercial centers in many countries around the world. We know that the bondholders have become much more important even in low-income countries. And the most prominent example of that at the moment is Zambia, which is experiencing serious problems on its debt front. We know that the G20's debt service sustainability initiative has been at best a limited success. So we need new options. And I would suggest there are two ways in which multi-stakeholder initiatives can play an important role in dealing with this.
And you'll have to, yeah.
And the two ways are, one is to introduce, what's necessary is to change the intercreditor dynamic. So they're open to new ways of thinking about debt and how to manage debt. One of those ways is to allow new international standards to be incorporated into dealing with debt. And second is to allow multi-stakeholder initiatives to play a more active role in thinking how the world can be used to deal with debt. And there's a number of ways in which that can be done, and we can go into that in question time if people are interested. So
we will go, we will go into that. I want you to speak about your DOVE, the idea of DOVE, and I'll come back to that. So that was a perspective on international financial institutions and multilateral development banks. And let's go to Professor Muhammad Khan. I believe you worked a lot on the area of cybersecurity and cyber regulations and technology. So the floor is yours for your 5-minute opening remark.
Thanks, Akshay, for moderating this outstanding panel. First of all, I would like to pay my profound gratitude to the T20 chair, Dr. Fahad Al-Turki, the task force chair, Dr. Yasin Arabi, and the task force coordinator, Ms. Al-Jawhara, for the kind invitation. I feel honored to be a speaker in several webinars of the T20 during the last few months. And today it's again my great privilege to be among the distinguished speakers and experts to discuss the multi-stakeholder approaches for a post-COVID-19 world. So it seems that we all panelists come from different specializations and experiences, so do I, and would like to share my insights from the cybersecurity perspective, which is a very, very hot area in the recent times. And as you know, all the discussions we have since this morning and in this webinar, that the COVID-19 pandemic has wreaked unprecedented havoc, around the globe with far-reaching impact on socio-economic system, which are far beyond our imagination. On the other hand, during all the disruptions we have over the last 7 months, the world's digital behavior, has also transformed when billions of people are turning to the internet under the strict lockdown and quarantine situations. Now, more and more people, including all of us, like we have this conference online, are using the smartphones and computing devices to spend everyday time, in the cyberspace for work, education, and entertainment. And it is also, estimated that currently we have almost over 4.57 billion people around the world who are using the internet. That is making approximately 60% of the total world population, which is indeed very, very huge, for us. And in addition to that numbers, we have a lot of internet users. They are growing exponentially over time, and with we have over 300 million users. They have been connected to the internet in the just last 12 months, and it is increasing very steadily, as the time is going on. However, there is a dark side of this hyperconnectivity and unparalleled dependence upon the cyberspace, which has rendered our society extremely vulnerable as far as cybersecurity is concerned. And as we know that the cyberspace and its systems are connected, and applications have a lot of known, even unknown vulnerabilities, and malicious actors are usually exploiting those vulnerabilities in different manners for their own advantages, or sometimes maybe for the financial gain, like we have a lot of ransomware kind of things are happening around the world. And recently we have seen a great surge of fake news, especially the mis or disinformation that is going to go create chaos and depression and even panic in our society. And sadly, many social media platforms have failed to curb this global challenge. And moreover, we are also observing and experiencing a large number of cyber criminal activities, such as phishing, ransomware, malware distribution, and different kind of attacks which are increasing with greater magnitude and sophistication every day. And these attacks are not only for the individuals, but they are also having impact on the business organizations, financial institutions, universities, and even the hospitals. And they are also becoming a big victim of the very sophisticated kind of, or maybe coordinated kind of attacks from anywhere in the world. So here I would like to just mention one recent example when a research lab of the University of California in San Francisco, that got hacked and paid a ransom of $1.14 million US to the cyber criminals. So actually those researchers, in that lab were working on a coronavirus treatment, which actually made them a cash cow for the hackers. So there are a lot of, same examples here, and these criminal activities are getting exponential momentum with more tenacity and, persistence over time. So hence we can say that cybersecurity has become a global issue of the 21st century. Therefore, we need a global response and multi-stakeholder cooperation to address it. And we also know that inclusive or multi-stakeholder kind of approaches to the policy making are not new, and we have been, these kind of policies have been tested and applied in a range of policy spaces, including, climate change, conflict resolution, peace building, and so on and so forth. So to address this all and propose some evidence-based policy solutions to the G20, we have actually published a policy brief entitled Heightening Cybersecurity to Promote Safety and Fairness for Citizens in the Post-COVID-19 Digital World. Actually, this policy brief was published in the Task Force 11. And in this policy brief, we have underscored the need of protecting citizens and online users from the cybersecurity threats. And we have proposed a set of recommendations to the G20 leaders and other stakeholders, including the global tech organizations and the policymakers. In this policy brief, actually, the first proposal is to establish a multilateral framework for cybersecurity protocols by building a set of international regulations to be incorporated into national regulatory systems around the world. And this framework actually would require tech service providers and business organizations to implement right systemic controls to prevent attacks and take appropriate remedial actions, whenever cyber breaches occur. In our second proposal, we have recommended to the G20 to encourage private sector, including technology platforms, to assist in efforts of raising the consumer cyber literacy and awareness by embedding educational information into systems and applications, especially for the digitally vulnerable population. And in our next recommendation, we have proposed to develop a cyber index to measure the collective progress and efforts that are aimed at protecting the consumers from cyber attacks. And in the last proposal of this policy brief, we have proposed to the G20 to broaden the community and skills of the capacity of cybersecurity professionals with more diversity and inclusion and more efforts in increasing the employment of women in cybersecurity industry. So there are a lot of issues to discuss about the cybersecurity challenges and solutions, but due to the limitation of time, I would just stop here and would be happy to discuss more policy solutions and recommendations during the discussion and Q&A session. Just last one thing here, I would like to acknowledge the efforts of my co-authors of this policy brief, which is contributed with Mr. Bhushan Sethi and Stephanie Goldberg from the PwC USA and Professor Paul Granger from the University College London. Thanks a lot for your attention and listening. Over to you, Akshay.
Thank you very much. And don't be rushed because I'm coming to all of you with a second set of questions, so you'll get a chance. I think one of the things that I've noticed based on your work as well as your interventions today, it almost seems like you're all working you're so knee deep in, or maybe neck deep in some of the areas that you work in, and I get the sense that the issues that we were dealing with pre-COVID have only worsened, have only exacerbated the intensity and the urgency with which we need to deal with those issues have only become a lot more important than they were. I see that when Shloka says that we should not substitute and deprioritize sustainability. In fact, that could be an answer to a green recovery. I see Professor Danny Bradler saying that I think maybe more accountability can help us stay on our feet, and you have some instruments and institutional mechanisms as well that you have suggested on how we can move forward. But that those issues remain, and I think I heard you say, Dr. Al-Raja, that that we already have these trade wars and tariffs, but with healthcare supply chains now, it becomes even more important to make sure that we have tariff-free, movement of goods, especially PPEs, etc. And of course, with you, Professor Khan, I've heard you say that cybersecurity has now become more important because everybody is now digital, and so it more of an emphasis. So I understand that you've all conveyed that the intensity and the importance of what you've done has only grown. I think I did not allow you time enough to actually speak on what some of the measures you have taken, or you can expand on some of the measures. But one of the things I'd like you to do, and I'll pose this question to all of you, is that are voluntary measures working, or do we need institutional measures? And I'll pose it to all of you and let you answer it, and I'll switch the sequence. Danny, you mentioned that there were some informal groupings, but we still needed independent evaluation offices, and you've suggested that maybe we need an accountability mechanism for the new era. You're also suggesting that you have certain instruments like Dove, which I want you to talk about. But should it be voluntary? You mentioned that maybe non-state actors need to be brought in. So should it be voluntary? Should it be institutional? Shloka, you of course lead a really unique platform. You have managed to bring together business leaders for a cause. And while there was already a resident sense of doing something for climate, but you provided a mechanism and a platform to do it. Should we still think of voluntary mechanisms? Some form of institutionalization helps. Professor Khan, you've talked about cybersecurity. You have recommended in your policy note, we should have an intergovernmental panel. G20 should have a multilateral framework on cybersecurity regulations. Should we leave it to the private sector, or do we need an institutional mechanism? And Professor Al-Rajeh, do we need an intergovernmental effort for healthcare supply chains, or can we, maybe this can be done voluntarily because the international trading system is now broken. So can we wait for the trading system to pick up? So this is the question to all the panelists. I'll switch up the sequence this time, and I'll ask Professor Danny Bradler to follow. After that, Professor Mohammed Khan, then Shloka, and then Mohammed Al-Rajeh. So Professor Danny Bradler, please take 5 minutes, not more than that, because then we can end with your closing remarks.
Thanks, Akshay. It's an important question. I would say because of the climate we're in at the moment, the political climate, the chances of sort of institutional change is very limited. And so that in the short run, at least, we need to focus on mechanisms that can work around those institutional blockages, which means market-based voluntary mechanisms. But we also need to recognize that the institutional problems are severe, and that we need the institutional arrangements at the global level are not really fit for purpose, and that over time we're going to need to adapt them to the changing world. And I don't often agree with Milton Friedman, but the one thing I do agree with him about is that when a crisis comes, people take the ideas that are available and use those to address the crisis. And so that one of the things we need to do while we're working on short-term measures that we can suggest, we can propose to the G20 on an annual basis in the short run, we need to be thinking carefully about how do we want institutions to exist for the world that will be there in the future. But in the short run, we have to focus on what's possible. And if you let me talk for a second about the Dove Fund, because I think that's a good example of what I mean in the short run.
Please do. We're taking 3 minutes each, so please do. You have time.
Okay. So part of the problem when you think about the debt problem is the reason it's been so hard to get any agreement at the G20 level is because bondholders are insisting on contract enforcement, and debtors are nervous that if they take relief through the debt service sustainability initiative or through other ways of asking for relief, the credit rating agencies downgrade them and their access to credit in the future will be limited. And so it seems to me what we need to think about is how do we shake up the dynamics on the creditor side so there's space for more creative solutions. Because the risk is, if we don't, is that bondholders will insist on their initial contract rights. They will sell their debt in the open market to vulture funds and other much more hardline recalcitrant groups. And so we need to think, how do we change it? And the Dove Fund says, look, we don't need to wait around for permission from the creditors to be more generous. We can create a fund that will buy the debt of developing countries and will say to those countries, we will manage your debt. We will work with you to manage your debt in a way that's consistent with the standards that the international community has agreed should be applicable to debt issues. So, for example, the UNTAD principles on responsible lending and borrowing, the principles, the UN principles on responsible investing, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And we will use those principles, and we will, by doing that, we will increase the reputational risk to other creditors that if they don't go along with this, they pay a price for that. We will, and this is the multi-stakeholder approach, we will raise the money for that fund from a variety of different sources. So we will say to individual citizens, foundations, companies, we will raise money from you, at least symbolically, because no one can imagine that we could be enough to deal with this problem just from that source. But we will raise money from you, so everybody's participating, and the creditors know it's the international community that's speaking in this regard. We will ask rich countries that have unused SDRs to allocate those SDRs for this purpose. We will say to the IMF, you have huge holdings of gold, which are valued at something like $138 billion. You can sell some of that to help. And we will, in that way, begin to change the dynamic and deal with the debt crisis. So it's a market solution, but a voluntary one.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Short term has to be market-based voluntary mechanism, but for institutional changes, you do need institutional instruments, such as Dove. Professor Khan, you have advocated the intergovernmental, like a multilateral framework for cyber regulations, institutional or voluntary? What would be better?
Okay, so Akshay, well, you have asked a wonderful question actually, because we are living in a global village. So therefore, our challenges, need more cooperation and multi-stakeholder approaches to address. If we just contextualize it, for the G20 and other maybe intergovernmental organizations or international organizations, it is important to develop open, inclusive, consensus-driven and transparent, policies and protocols, and we need to engage different stakeholders around the world to resolve the most pressing, challenges, especially we would be having, in the post-COVID-19 world. Because I would like to, focus or emphasize from cybersecurity perspective, that is my specialization. So I would just say that, as like we all are creating gigantic amount of data, every day and spending huge amount of time in the online world for work, education, and other activities for socialization and so on. So there is a dire need of building some kind of protocols and frameworks for a resilient and safe cyberspace for all. So it should be very, inclusive for all the people around the world, not only for some segment of the society or maybe some most vulnerable populations or least developed countries, they affect because of that. So that is not a good solution. I think G20, in the context of G20, if you just see that we have to play a very instrumental kind of role to establish a set of international regulations that can be applied whenever malicious and kind of practices, occur in the cyberspace against the individuals, organizations, and the governments, around the world. No doubt it is a very complex problem, and its scale is too huge. Like I mentioned earlier, we have almost 4.6 billion people, they are connected to the internet, and every year we have 300 million more people, they are going to the online, and our children are, using internet for their education, for socialization, and so on and so forth. So the question is how to do it, because the scale is growing bigger and bigger and very complex. So the nature of the cyberspace is getting very, very complex every day. So I think we need to, especially if you just see the G20 and maybe some other organizations around the world, we need to sponsor a task force, of experts in the cybersecurity from the both public and private sectors, to develop a framework which has a basic cybersecurity protocols, and we need to establish some kind of international regulations, that should be incorporated into the national, regulatory systems around the world. Because we have very fragile kind of, regulatory systems around the world, if you just see in different, societies. So this actually endeavor would help to address the security of the online data, privacy of the individuals, which is very, very important, especially when we are tracking, people around the world because of the COVID-19. And we need to build the guidelines on safety issues. That is very, very important when everybody is going online. And we have to encourage the development of low cost, but robust cybersecurity protocols and standards, which are very, very, important for all the society. So the establishment of this task force, could reinforce the existing, international efforts, and can reassure the citizens that the cyberspace is reasonably secure. On the other hand, we have a lot of regulations. They require tech organizations and businesses to implement right systematic controls, so that they can prevent the users and their privacy also. So finally, the implementation and enforcement of such regulations will also help to safeguard the investment in cybersecurity, especially when organizations have weak balance sheets and very low costs, spending on the cybersecurity due to the pandemic. So I hope this answers your question, Akshay. Thank you.
It does. Thank you very much. I mean, clearly institutional mechanism for you. Shloka, you're next. What kind of a system would you prefer? What kind of system or what kind of direction can we give to some of the leaders on global governance? What kind of system would work best?
It's a great question, Akshay. And honestly, overall, I think we need a narrative change from sort of the ease of doing business to the ease of doing climate. And that really does require a massive sort of structural, sort of shift in our thinking. It requires policy stability. It requires a rethinking of our energy subsidies to prioritize clean energy access. It requires international signaling on our climate commitments, as well as developing a narrative that balances mitigation goals with the principles of, inclusion, sustainability, justice, and equity for all. And there are a number of sort of critical sectors for resilient recovery post-COVID that are going to be very crucial for us to push forward. It's the need for institutions could not be sort of more dire or greater than ever before. And to just give you a quick set of examples, the financial sector right now is waking up to the risks posed by systemic issues like climate change, not just to sort of vulnerable populations, but also national economies. And something that really stands out for me is the need for the financial industry to reorient itself in several ways. It needs to internalize climate risk assessment in its investments as well as financial products. And it also needs to start identifying green investment opportunities for cleaner, sustainable infrastructure assets and businesses. And this is really where institutions can take the lead in ushering in these transitions. To give you a couple of quick examples, we could create something like a green task force. And this is actually being done in the UK. There's a joint effort between the UK government and the City of London. This could be done for India, for so many developing nations. And the Green Task Force designs the overall roadmap for promoting green finance. It advocates necessary policy and regulatory changes. It promotes the City of London as a green finance hub. And that's just a great sort of example of what we sort of need to replicate across the board. And, transnational sort of cooperation and approaches would really help in aiding and abetting these kind of structural shifts. Another one is just developing a green finance strategy overall. Again, for many sort of national economies. It involves generating awareness. It means coordinating a host of efforts. To give you an example, within India, the Indian government could, through Niti Aayog, its think tank, it could create a green finance strategy and use that to coordinate amongst policymakers, regulators, institutional investors, and consumers. And the only way forward is going to be driving that sort of awareness, understanding, and availability of green investment options over alternatives. So that's just a quick snapshot. Of course, there are a whole host of other sectors that are going to be really, really crucial, from land use to energy, of course, as well as water for the developing world, and of course air quality. And all of these across the board are going to require institutional responses to not only build the ecosystems, but really to drive interventions that are, while local and context specific, they include community participation, but are also very representative of the global narrative and speak to global coordination on each of these pieces, as well as design And that's going to be, it's complex, but it is going to require a tremendous amount of coordination, and institutions are going to be at the helm of this. So I'll pause here and hand it back to you.
Thank you,
But
Shloka.
happy to answer any
Actually,
questions.
no, you reminded me that, one of the, that, narratives and direction, you use these two words in the first set of remarks and now, is so important, because what tends to happen with in multilateral institutions or any kind of global governance forums is that we sometimes have the narrative and it's set out in the vision, but we don't have the plumbing or the institutional mechanism to implement it. And the other way around too, we have the institutional mechanisms, but not the narrative, which in your second set of remarks, you started out by saying that we need a new narrative. Sometimes we don't have the narrative, focus too much on the plumbing. And so thank you so much. Rajay, you have any hope for the trading system? Because you seem to have made a lot of recommendations on the healthcare value chains. So I'll let you answer 3 minutes, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. In our policy brief, we propose the establishment of a new intergovernmental coalition among the group of 20 G20 nations to oversee the healthcare value chains. The international community should revive the WTO Pharmaceutical Tariff Elimination Agreement signed in 1994. It abolished tariffs on final goods and certain components. However, this agreement must be updated and enhanced to better reflect the current state of production in the healthcare industry. Global value chain complexities must be reviewed and reassessed, and a substantial greater proportion of countries must be covered by the agreement. The coalition that we propose should provide a platform that brings together regulators from relevant bodies in charge of controlling pharmaceutical and healthcare supply in the G20, while facilitating closer collaboration between the member states and developing smarter and more effective approaches to regulation, trade, and distribution. The platform we were proposing could also consolidate and enhance the development of shared databases within the member states that track the availability of medical supplies and impending shortages to provide a clearer picture of existing healthcare value chains. This would allow for higher data transparency and the monitoring of both healthcare system performance and the capacity during states of emergency, promote producers to reduce regulatory barriers and facilitate regulatory cooperation, unify mandatory standards, specifications for medical goods, and eliminate unnecessary costs. Essentially, this will ensure the integrity of the medical supplies while establishing globally accepted and achievable guidelines for production methods and quality and assurances. The platform we propose would promote mutual recognition of pharmaceutical regulation and food regulations within member states based on widely accepted accreditation programs that evaluate by mutually approved inspection units and certification bodies. I end my comments that we can all learn from the experience of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, also OPEC Plus and OPEC Plus Plus during the COVID-19 pandemic, coming together and saving the oil industry. We need a similar format for a formal intergovernmental coalition as an advocate for the global healthcare industry and its supply chains during the times of crisis. Eyal, back to you.
Thank you very much. I asked a provocative question, but I think all of you have reminded me that the answer is not usually either or. It is usually getting it right at the right time, in the right sequence, for the right cause and in the right way. I think I'll go backwards. I think, Dr. Alarajee, you've reminded that we need maybe not lose hope on the trading system just yet. There are some institutional mechanisms and there are certain treaties that we have that we can still work on. Shloka, you've reminded the importance of the narrative and the vision that needs to be undergirded by maybe an institutional mechanism and a call for action. I noted your words that in the end, what would matter is large-hearted, rational ways are the only potent antidote to cynicism. So clearly there is a need for narrative, because that would be our motivation as well. Professor Mohammed Khan, I noted that you also still believe that cybersecurity, while institutions and private sector can move at different speeds, is too complex a space to just be left for itself. We need protocol and standards for interoperability, and also for attributing if there are malicious attacks, to finding attributing sources and finding a legal framework for accountability. And Danny Bradler, I think you reminded that the debt which is going to accumulate, especially for the most vulnerable economies. We will need not just any institutional framework, but a very sophisticated institutional framework, so that we can make sure that the vulnerable economies can come out of whatever situation they are likely to get into and already are, but also so that we can set some kind of a template to deal with these issues going into the future. That was my takeaways, and my only request to the panelists as well as to the viewers would be, please keep an eye on this on the takeaways that will come out of this webinar, which ORF has co-hosted with the T20 Saudi Secretariat. And also please follow the T20 Saudi Arabia as well as G20 Saudi Arabia. Both the T20 Saudi Arabia summit is going to happen very soon, as well as the G20 summit is going to happen very soon. Please keep an eye on the kind of deliberations that will happen there and the outcomes that the leaders are going to publish. It will be important for all of us in our respective fields, given that we are involved in public policy or in some kind of a inter and multi-stakeholder challenge that we're all involved in. I think it'll be valuable. With that, the only thing left for me is to thank the panelists for joining us today and taking out your valuable time on behalf of ORF and the T20 Saudi Secretariat. I'll hand it over back to the T20 Saudi Secretariat now. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Akshay, and all the panel members for the interesting discussion. The themes laid out in the two panel discussions have been of immense value and also raises issues that need to be taken forward. For that view of what the future holds, and also as Italy assumes the G20 leadership for the next year, I would like to welcome Mr. Ferdinando Nelli Ferrocci, the President of the Institute of International Affairs, to share an Italian perspective. Mr. Ferrocci, please.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. And thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this final session of the Task Force 11 on COVID. I am the president of one of the two institutes which will co-chair the activities of the T20 next year during the Italian presidency of the G20, and I'm very happy to participate in today's proceedings. Let me elaborate very few remarks on COVID and on its impact, also because I'm sure that also next year we'll have to deal with COVID, inevitably, unfortunately. COVID has been a dramatic wake-up call for all national governments, international institutions, public opinions. We were not prepared to face such a devastating pandemic, and we are now suffering the social and economic consequences of this unpredictable black swan, as I would define it. So far, up to today, more than 43 million persons have been infected by the virus, and more than 1,150,000 persons have died of COVID. After a relative break during the summer season, particularly in this part of the world, a second wave of contagions is hitting many countries. And Europe is particularly affected by this second wave. In the last week, more than 46% of the new contagions were registered in Europe. So the pandemic is still active, is still alive. Even though some countries are more effective than others in containing the contagions, the pandemic is still there. And despite some relative and slow progress in the search of therapies and vaccines, the outcome, the evolution of the pandemic is unfortunately still unpredictable. So we are far from the end of the pandemic. We know that we will have to live with the pandemic for some time in the future, but we can already draw some preliminary conclusions over its impact. And I have noticed that we can list at least 3 emergencies that were provoked by COVID. The first one is a health emergency, sanitary emergencies. National governments and international institutions, as I said, were not prepared to face the pandemic of such a scope. They are not equipped to deal with the first wave, and unfortunately, they seem to be not equipped to deal with the second wave, which is even more problematic, if I may say so. Governments at the beginning have reacted in a rather uncoordinated manner. Only with the process of learning by doing, they have learned to better coordinate their initiative, their measures, and their decisions. In general terms, I would assume that the emergencies has highlighted a need for a much more effective and concerted action at international level, as well as a need to create a more robust and resilient health governance architecture to increase resilience of national health services and to equip them with the necessary human and technical resources, to improve cooperation in the exchange of data about the evolution of the pandemic, and in the definition of common standards on the measures needed to contain the contagions. And finally, of course, to improve and increase cooperation for the development of effective therapies and vaccines. By the way, the national organizations have not been particularly effective and performing, and they have revealed structural shortcomings that should be tackled in the next phase. Looking in particular at WHO, I think that there is a lot that can be done and should be done to improve its performance, to revise and review its competences and responsibilities. And this is also true for regional organizations. Also, regional organizations could and should do better in dealing with pandemic in the future. Even an institution like the European Union, which is deeply integrated, has very few competences in the field of health and has very few responsibilities to tackle a situation like the one we have faced with COVID-19. The second emergency has been an economic emergency. The second challenge is, of course, the challenge which has hit the global economy, which is already witnessing a recession of an unprecedented scope and nature. Nothing similar. We've seen nothing similar since at least 1945. We know already, and this is something which has been told to us by many international institutions like the IMF or the OECD, this year there will be a sharp reduction in GDPs all over the world. Not all at the same level, but certainly this is going to be a disastrous from the point of view of economic performance in most countries of the world. This crisis will have a serious impact on industrial output. We will see significant contraction also in the service sector, particularly the educational activities and service related to mobility, tourism, and retail commerce in most countries of the world, if not in all countries of the world. And also international trade and global value chains will be affected with inevitable effects on the dynamics of globalization. Now, so far, we have seen that most governments have adopted national measures, of course, of different scope and intensity, but most of them with convergent objectives, which was that of providing financial support to national economies, to individuals and companies, through an injection of massive public funds into the economy, and with also a consequent increase in the level of public debt practically all over the world. These measures, as I said, were convergent, but they were national, and in most cases, they've been adopted outside the framework of coordination. I am of the opinion, we are of the opinion in Italy, that there should be more cooperation, more consultation, and more coordination at the international level. By the way, so far, international cooperation in tackling the economic consequences of COVID has been insufficient and inadequate. I think that there is a lot of scope for a group of countries like the G20 to do more, to contrast, to reduce the impact of the economic recession. So far, G20 has been able to announce only a suspension of the repayment of public debts of the least developed countries. It should at least become a permanent moratorium. But I think that the G20 should have the responsibility to define a global strategy to revive and re-stimulate global economy through public and private investment plans, by relaunching international trade and restoring international value chains, and reducing also inequalities in wealth distribution, both within countries and among countries. In other words, I think that the G20 should assume a political initiative aimed at coordinating a common response to the consequences of the global recession. The third emergency, which has been provoked by COVID, has been a social emergency, which was a direct consequence of the economic emergencies. We've seen that in most countries, in order to be able to reduce contagions, the measures of lockdowns and physical distancing have been adopted, which have had an impact on economic activities. They have particularly hit some sectors of the population, those that were more exposed to the suspension of economic activities. And these measures have increased the differences in the wealth distribution and in income distribution. In particular, the informal sector of the economies has suffered more than the rest of the economies. We've also seen that COVID has reduced the migratory flows. They will probably restart again once the situation will normalize. And last but not least, this is a phenomenon which has been described quite well in one of the sessions of this afternoon. It has had an impact on the educational system of our countries. Most of our schools and our university was forced to suspend the lessons and to move towards a digital system of lesson, which still has to prove its ability to perform in the same manner as a physical activity, which was performed before the pandemic. I think that the stimulus package, which are being adopted and will continue to be adopted by our governments, will have to be inclusive. Growth will have to be inclusive, and possibly they will have to be adopted through social dialogue in order exactly to increase inclusiveness of these plans and programs and strategies for recovery and a relaunch of the economies. Now, if one looks at the future, because we also have to look at the future, I have to say that at present, in Europe in particular, unfortunately, we are back to the situation we were facing during the spring. So we are back to a situation where we are confronted with the necessity to deal with an emergency. Such emergency was unfortunately largely foreseeable, but most countries did not anticipate the measures that are needed to avoid a second wave. Now we're paying probably the consequence of an excessive complacency during the summer. Our main efforts are now concentrated on the need to contain the spread of contagions, again, as it was the case in spring, to avoid excessive hospitalization and to treat at their homes the sick or infected persons whose number is growing on a daily basis. But if one looks at the future, once we will hopefully have solved this emergency phase, this emergency situation, the pandemic should and could be also an opportunity. This is a point which is very important. We have to look at the future with a certain degree of optimism. We have to be able to develop reconstruction programs based on environmental and social sustainability and on resilience of our economies. We have to invest on energy transition. We have to invest in the fight against climate change and in the green economies and in increased digitalization. We have to promote sustainable mobility and smart cities. We have to utilize new working methods based on a widespread use of smart working, and we have to invest more than we have been able to do so far on education, research, and innovation. And finally, last but not least, one of the lessons we have learned from COVID is that we have to invest more on improving the performances and the resilience of our national public health services. In Europe, we have adopted a comprehensive strategy, and particularly referring to the case of the European Union, which is meant both to assist the member states in the efforts to afford and tackle the first impacts of COVID, but also in assisting member states in the effort to reconstruct their economies in the medium longer term. It's an important sign of how important is international cooperation to face the challenges of such an unprecedented crisis. We do not pretend, Europe does not pretend to teach anyone what to do. We do not want to give lessons. We do not want to be the example, but simply I quoted this because I think that Europe's experience should be an incentive to strengthen international cooperation in dealing with such a major shock. And I'm sure and I'm confident that G20 could do a lot in this respect. Now, finally, coming to my conclusion, unfortunately, I have to say that we will have to deal with COVID also next year, inevitably. It's going to be in the agenda of G20, it's going to be in the agenda of our T20, and I can anticipate that we are planning in the organization of our work as co-chair of the T20 activities to have a dedicated task force, I don't know which will be the number, on health cooperation and on COVID-19. Thank you again very much for giving me this opportunity, and I wish all the best to the Saudi presidencies of the G20 and of the T20. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Feroci, for an extremely interesting account of what promises to be a year of progress under the Italian presidency. Moving forward, we have a very special and very interesting art presentation by a Saudi artist. Art is a universal expression transcending barriers of language and time, and the T20 Saudi Arabia uses art to communicate its themes, priorities, and policy recommendations. Today, we are honored to be viewing the art of Nofis Mari, an artist whose work I personally admire and have followed for quite some time now. Nof grew up in Dhahran, the eastern region of Saudi Arabia, and graduated from King Faisal University. She's a self-taught painter who weaves layered narratives within her works, and she wants to create paintings that are impossible to walk past. This art piece we're going to see today, acrylic on canvas, is titled Night Visitors. This artwork is a representation of what human race continues to experience in 2020, symbolizing the spirit of mankind during these trying times. The distance figures at the bottom are meant to represent the creativity that allowed mankind to rethink some of the problems we were faced with throughout this year. We are now going to watch the video.
زوار الليل هو من ضمن سلسلة أعمال كنت أعمل عليها يمكن من عام 2015. نقدر نشوف فيه يمكن كيف إنه خيالات الأشكال والناس اللي قاعدين يمشون فيه ما بين إنه مخلوقات حيوانات بين النخيل، كأنهم ماشيين في الصحراء يتبعون سراب. أتذكر في وقتها وأنا أرسمها كان إلى حد ما الملهم لي قصيدة لمحمد الثبيتي تغريبة القوافل والمطر لما كان يقول ما أبعد الماء ما أبعد الماء. فهذه الطريقة اللي هم يسعون ويبحثون كأنهم يلحقون وراء أحلامهم، كأنهم يتحدون هذا العدم المترامي من حولهم. العربي القديم في حياته في الصحراء وقسوتها ما كان شيء سهل في أنه يتواجه معها ويكيف حياته ويبني نفسه من هناك. وحالياً في الجائحة اللي قاعدين نعيشها الآن ما هو أمر سهل أيضاً أنه الإنسان يتخطاها. فدائما أرى أن الإنسان الصحراء هو هذا الإنسان العظيم الذي لديه القدرة على تجاوز كل الصعاب. هو هذا الشخص الذي استنطق العدم وتمكن من أنه يصل من نقطة لا شيء في ثقافة الصحراء وكل توابعها، وصلنا بها إلى الآن. المملكة جدا ملهمة بكل موروثها، فقط هو مسألة أنه إعادة الصياغة وتقديمها بشكلها الجديد، مثل ما قاعدين إحنا نشتغل الآن مع الجيل الحالي. أصبح جدا يعتز بهويته وجدا يعتز باللي موجود حوله وصار يقدمه بشكله الجديد.
We are delighted to be joined by Nofis Mari in person. She's going to speak about her art and her views on the thematic expression with the task force. Please note that English-Arabic translation is available. If you need it, just select the audio language by clicking the interpretation tab at the bottom of the screen in Zoom. Nof, you have the floor.
هلا ومرحبا، يعطيكم العافية وشكرا على وقتكم. عملي المشارك معاكم زوار الليل بدأت يمكن من 2015 وأنا شغالة على نوع من سلسلة الأعمال لها تقريبا نفس طريقة التنفيذ، إلا أنه لكل عمل طريقته في طرح القصة. قد يكون الفكرة إلى حد ما متشابهة ومتسلسلة. عمل زوار الليل فيه مشهدية الارتحال وسط الصحراء، إن كان على النجدي بوجه أخص أو كل من أفراد شبه الجزيرة، كيف في وقت ما كان الارتحال في تحدي الفقر، في تحدي البحث عن القطر والغذاء، في أنه يتحدون الحياة ويشكلون طريقة ونمط عيشهم. كان جدا من سمات فرد شبه الجزيرة. في وقت تنفيذ هذه اللوحة كان يمكن الشيء اللي بعثني إلى حد ما إلى هذا المشهد هو جزء من قصيدة تغريبة القوافل والمطر لمحمد الثبيتي: ما أبعد الماء ما أبعد الماء، ألا والذي خضبته رمال شبه الجزيرة يرد الماء. عنده هذا الإصرار في مطاردة، ما بقول السراب قد ما أنه هذا الامتداد للبعيد اللي يخليك ما تزال أنه تحلم، ولا مانع من أن تطارد حلمك ولا مانع من أن تسعى إليه. فهذا يعني أحد الأشياء اللي بعثت لي أنه أعمل هذا العمل. علاقة العمل بما يحدث الآن أو بالوضع العالمي الآن اللي هي الجائحة كوفيد-19، دائما عندي هذا الإيمان بفرد شبه الجزيرة أنه قادر على التحدي وقادر على صنع حياته من اللا شيء إلى ما وصلنا إليه الآن، تجعله سمته الأهم والأبرز في مواجهة كل شيء يحاول أن يصعب حياته، إن شئنا القول أو يجعل أمره، ما بقول صعب، لأن دائما أحس عندنا هذا الإصرار والعناد يمكن في إنه نصل إلى ما نريد أن نصل إليه. عندنا همة يعني لا يستطيع أحد أن ينكرها، في إنه في هذا الوقت القصير وصلنا لما وصلنا إليه الآن. الفرد العربي في شبه الجزيرة العربية دائما عنده هذه القدرة في طرق مفازات الصحراء واكتشافها حتى على أبسط الكائنات. من الأشياء اللي طرحتها أيضا في اللوحة هو استخدامهم للحيوانات في الانتقال وقطع المساحات الواسعة للصحراء، ومكان العدم وانعدام المشهد أمامهم يشكل لهم أي صعوبة. فتقريبا that's about it.
شكرا جزيلا نوف. Thank you Nof so much for sharing.
شكرا لك.
Your beautiful piece and insight. Before I pass on the mic to Dr. Fahad, I would just like to say that it has been an honor and privilege to be part of the T20 journey. And I would like to thank Dr. Yasin Arabi, the task force lead co-chair, Dr. Fahad Turki, of course, all the task force authors, members, and in specific, the task force advisors, Sarah Caston and Fatih Karamfil, for their extremely valuable support and input throughout the year. Without further ado, we are now getting ready to wrap up this webinar, and I hand over to Dr. Fahad Al-Turki, Chair of T20 Saudi Arabia and Vice President and Head of Research at CAPSARC, for the closing remarks. Dr. Fahad, you have the floor.
Thank you, Johra. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for everybody who joined us today. This is a very unique task force, to see the least. Not only because the subject that we cover touches everybody, including the North and the South, whether you live in a developing country or you live in a developed countries, you've been touched and affected by the pandemic. So it's not only unique because of that, it's also unique because it shows how the think tank community is very dynamic in terms of observing the initial shock of the pandemic and responding positively and effectively and providing concrete policy recommendations to the G20 leaders when they are really in need of them. So I think that makes this task force unique compared to the others. In addition to this, we only started the task force back in March. So we have a very short time to select the priorities, to reflect on the priorities in a very uncertain environment. I think the authors have delivered, and a special thanks to our lead co-chair and the coordinator and the advisors of the task force, as well as the authors. Very impressive work. I want to tell a story behind the scene of how we decided on getting this task force to be up and running. In March, we were debating whether we should introduce a new task force or introduce the COVID-19 as an overarching theme. And there was a different opinion on the advantage and disadvantage of each one. And there were difficulties and challenges for each of the choices. But we opted to make the relevant and the important choice of choosing both options. So we decided that it is an overarch, in consultation with the lead co-chairs of the task forces and the co-chairs, that we should consider COVID-19 as an overarching theme across all the task forces, as well as introduce a new task force. And I mentioned the dynamic and the response of the T20 community. When we called for abstracts for the new task force, within 2 weeks, we received a massive number of interest and response. Like more than 75 abstracts was received in 2 weeks' time. Very impressive. So thank you all for your contribution and support during these difficult times. Fast forward to now, all of these policy briefs or proposals were put on a fast track and were translated into 18 policy briefs. And one of the things that's interesting about this task force, despite the challenge, the related uncertainty and so on, there were 104 authors contributed to the policy briefs. 87 institutions coming from 26 countries. So we're talking about inclusive, the voice from G20 and non-G20 countries. This task force represents that. And we divided it into, as Dr. Yassin mentioned in his opening remark, into main 6 themes that are tackling not only health-related issues, but also socioeconomics, related to education, resilient society, the supply chain, multilateralism, as well as climate and environment. So the T20 have demonstrated with the T20 community, demonstrated that think tanks are relevant. Think tanks can provide relevant and research-based policy recommendations in a very short period of time, in a very difficult circumstances. And this task force is just a testimony of that. The main result, as I hear the panels today and the discussion and the keynote, I think what we learn from the deliberation and the discussion, that COVID-19 has reconfirmed what was already well established, that health is basically a global public good. And it can only be achieved effectively through our cooperation and collaboration and partnerships. And we have demonstrated that under the T20, and we call on the G20 to even adopt a further collaboration and cooperation in the face of the pandemic. After all, we, as Dr. Yassin mentioned, we are as strong as our weakest link. We will only be able to overcome this pandemic and assume our shared responsibility for preparedness for shared emergencies if we are working together. So some of the recommendations that we included in the T20 communique are reaffirming the significance of health as a global public good, as well as embrace a comprehensive and universal healthcare coverage, and promote global solidarity and multilateralism in response to COVID-19. So these are some of the recommendations that I picked during the webinar today, as well as from the task forces or the policy briefs that were shared by the authors. I would like to also mention that I represent the T20 Secretariat here in Saudi, and on behalf of the T20 Secretariat, I would like to extend a special thank to our lead co-chair, our coordinator, our advisors in the task force, as well as the authors. I think coming along in a very short period of time demonstrate the commitment of the T20 toward our main or core responsibility, which is providing research-based solutions to the authorities. This is our last but not least task force, definitely, webinar. So we have conducted now 10 webinars, and this is the 11th. And we have seen a tremendous support on these webinars. That's part of our summit season. But so far, I'll just give you a few brief about what we have done so far in these summit webinars. We had more than 170 speakers participating in more than 70 sessions, keynotes, panels, and so on, reflecting on the result of the main policy recommendations that we have provided to the G20. We have more than 4,000 participants attending our T20 webinars. And we care so much about the continuity of the T20. We want the issues that covered in Italy, in Japan, to be covered in Saudi as well as in T20 Italy. So for each of our summit webinars, we have an Italian representative providing a keynote to reflect on the issues that are covered in Saudi Arabia and how it will be covered in Italy. And we appreciate the hard work from our Italian partners on this regard. But we're still not yet done. We're not yet at the summit. We are at the summit season. And the final 2 days of the summit will be this Saturday and Sunday. And I'm glad to say that more than 1,300 registration are already there for attending the summit. And I invite everybody to come to participate. We will re-emphasize the themes of Saudi T20. That is on climate and environment, women, empowering women and youth, multilateralism, economic development and finance, sustainable resources, technology and digitalizations. Definitely COVID-19 pandemic will be an overarching theme. We will present officially, we will present our recommendations to the G20. We will have an official representations from the Saudi G20 Secretariat to receive that. It's so I would like to also thank our co-leading institutions, CAPSARC and KF-CRIS, for their continuous support throughout the year, throughout the Saudi T20 presidency. For without them, we wouldn't have been able to make the conversion from an in-person meeting to virtual meetings and run these meetings very smoothly. There's a huge team behind the scene that works on this, devoted to make sure that we are delivering what we are supposed to deliver as a T20 community to the G20 leaders. And special thank goes to them. I will leave you with something, and then we will continue to do that until we will meet in person or during the summit virtually, and then hopefully in person in Italy at some point. We will continue to strive for a future of prosperity, sustainability, and inclusion. And that's the vision of T20 Saudi Arabia, and we will continue to pursue that. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you on Saturday. Ma'as salama.